Did you know the Star Trek theme technically has lyrics, and that the only reason it does was so the creator could make more money? Get up to warp speed on Star Trek with these essential facts true fans need to know.
If there is one catchphrase Star Trek is best known for, it's "Beam me up, Scotty."
Beam me up, Scotty!
Despite the prominence of this phrase, and even actor James Doohan using it as the title of his autobiography, the simple truth is that Kirk never said it. At least he never said it exactly.
Beam us up. You may beam us aboard. Beam me up.
You'll never find the exact phrase, "Beam me up, Scotty," in any official Star Trek show or movie, but it does occasionally pop up in Star Trek novels and other media. This misquoted phrase can join the one never actually uttered by Data's favourite detective, Sherlock Holmes. Elementary, my dear Watson. Most fans regard Star Trek: The Next Generation as the first legit sequel to the original Star Trek, both in spirit and continuity. However, it turns out that there was an entire galaxy of adventures that plenty of people were simply unaware of, until it popped up on their Netflix queue. Years after the original Star Trek stopped producing new episodes, there was an animated series of completely new adventures, voiced by almost the entire original cast. Most of the episodes are even considered as part of the Star Trek story canon, with later live-action Trek episodes referencing animated events. The animated series lasted 2 seasons and was nearly replaced a few years later by another live-action series called Star Trek Phase 2. Instead, Paramount determined their pilot would make a better movie, and this, combined with their runaway success of Star Wars at movie theaters at the time, sent Star Trek to the big screen instead. Fans forgot about the cartoons and the series that almost was, leaving The Next Generation as the third planned sequel series rather than the first. One of the reasons that fans so passionately debate the superior captain, Kirk versus Picard, is that the characters seem completely different, and that's no mistake. Picard is quiet and diplomatic in scenarios where Kirk would be a loud cowboy, and Kirk would probably never discuss Shakespeare with an android when he could share a stiff drink with a country doctor instead. Because of this pointed contrast, many people simply assume that Picard is a stickler for the rules, especially the main rule of Starfleet, the Prime Directive, which basically states that you should never seriously interfere with aliens who aren't as advanced as you. Basically, he doesn't take any nonsense.
Sir, I know this may finish me as an acting ensign, but—
Shut up, Wesley!
But believe it or not, Picard is way more reckless than Kirk. Take the season 4 episode The Drumhead, for example.
Would it surprise you to learn that you have violated the Prime Directive a total of 9 times since you took command of the Enterprise? I must say, Captain, it surprised the hell out of me.
9 times. And he was just getting started. This includes saving hapless Wesley Crusher from a death sentence for breaking a greenhouse on a planet of aliens with bad hair, and allowing Data to save his alien pen pal's planet from complete destruction. So, much like Kirk, Picard doesn't usually hesitate to bend the rules when he feels there's more at stake than bureaucracy. Because Spock is a Vulcan driven entirely by logic, he often presents himself as being free of emotions. Except he's totally not. Part of the reason is that Spock is actually half human, and as you can probably tell by the comments on this video, humans are an emotional mess. But in truth, Vulcans have very intense emotions that they choose to bury because of their beliefs. Even Spock's all-Vulcan half-brother Sybok crusaded against Vulcan emotional suppression. As for Spock, there was the time he accidentally got high from an alien plant and had an emotional hookup with one of the natives. Another time he freaks out because he realizes he enjoyed eating meat.
I'm behaving disgracefully. I have eaten animal flesh and I've enjoyed it. What is wrong with me?
Later, he cries softly when he realizes that the intelligent space probe V'Ger is experiencing the emptiness that Spock once felt. So, contrary to popular belief, Spock totally gets the feels. It's a theme that would be repeated with characters in nearly every Trek series, from Voyager's 7 of 9 to The Next Generation's Data. The original Star Trek was bold in a number of ways, and it is often credited for a particular landmark, the first interracial kiss on American television, occurring in the episode Plato's Stepchildren. The plot involved the crew being turned into puppets by powerful space jerks who could make them do anything, and one of the things they do is force Kirk and Uhura to kiss. Nervous NBC executives shot several alternate takes so they wouldn't offend their southern viewers and affiliates, but as the story goes, William Shatner reportedly started making goofy faces to ruin the alternate takes, forcing the studio to air the kiss. Was it historic? Yes, but it wasn't the first. That honor goes to a TV special called Movin' with Nancy, which aired a few months before the Star Trek episode and had a number of memorable cameos, including Sammy Davis Jr., who gives Nancy Sinatra a kiss at the end of his scene. Casual fans generally believe that there is no money in the 23rd and 24th centuries, mostly because of the words of the captains themselves.
The economics of the future are somewhat different. You see, money doesn't exist in the 24th century.
Could we have that to go, please?
Sure. Who gets the bad news?
Don't tell me they don't use money in the 23rd century.
Well, we don't.
Seems pretty clear cut, right? Except plenty of episodes of Star Trek prove this wrong. Kirk offers to pay some grubby miners to settle a dispute, and the crew later buys tribbles with what seems to be some form of currency.
And 10 credits apiece is a very reasonable price. Now you can see for yourself how much the lovely little lady appreciates the finer thing.
1 credit apiece.
About 100 years later, Dr. Crusher casually buys some crap from a marketplace and sends the bill to the ship. Later, the Federation participates in an auction for a stable wormhole, and the whole crew on Deep Space Nine regularly buys drinks, rents holosuites, and gambles at Quark's bar. So maybe it's safer to say that Earth and even the Federation is a post-scarcity society, but applying that idea to the whole galaxy, well, that's just bad business. In addition to making fans' hearts flutter by wearing a variety of non-regulation uniforms, ship counselor Deanna Troi is an empath. She's able to read the emotions of others. It seemed perfect that the ship's resident shrink was able to directly connect with people's feelings, so most fans assumed that this was the power she was originally designed to have. The truth is a bit more complicated. Originally, Troi was meant to have full telepathy, which is clear in the pilot episode.
Can you still sense my thoughts?
In later episodes, Troy's powers were changed to give her empathic abilities, partially because actress Marina Sirtis disliked the emotional soliloquies that she had to recite because she was able to read people so clearly. Having someone who could completely read minds also presented storytelling issues, since it's tough to maintain a mystery when one character can read everybody else's thoughts.
I'm sensing someone tying me down to a bed?
It's probably nothing. We should probably just change course.
Nonetheless, the showrunners struggled with working around her powers. Writers dropped her from a few first season episodes and nearly cut the character altogether. That wasn't the only bullet Troi dodged. Originally, her character was supposed to have a few extra breasts. When 7 of 9 first showed up on Star Trek Voyager, many assumed her casting was something of a ratings ploy. After all, they were essentially replacing the benign and boring alien Kes with a blonde bombshell in a skin-tight catsuit. Even Kate Mulgrew, who played Captain Catherine Janeway, initially thought that the role wasn't meant to be much more than a sexy gimmick inserted into what was essentially the most explicitly feminist Star Trek show. Ultimately, however, 7 of 9 played out as a very positive female role model, often rebuffing unwanted male attention. She becomes an instrumental part of the crew, helping them establish actual communication with Starfleet, and often serves as a powerful counterpoint to Janeway's perspective. And her entire story tackles the message of actualization and individual identity as she shakes off the trauma from being forced into the Borg collective and becomes her own person with her own strength and values. Ultimately, the character that many dismissed as simply being sexy and exploitative ended up being one of Trek's most inspiring women. Of course, while we're on the subject of inspiring women, casual fans thinking about the original Trek series seem to think that every episode involved green women or short-skirted Starfleet ladies throwing themselves at the feet of the famous Captain Kirk. In fact, the green Orion slave girl that everyone thinks of as Kirk's most notorious conquest, she never even met Kirk. That scene featured Captain Christopher Pike in Star Trek's original pilot episode, which was written and filmed before Kirk's creation. Sure, another one came along later, but he really wasn't having it.
Keep your hands off Kirk, you treacherous thing.
This misconception of Kirk as a straight-up horn dog is so firmly ingrained in fans' minds that it was played up by the Trek reboot, in which Kirk ogles the requisite green woman, hits on Uhura, and even gets distracted by some pretty faces on the Starfleet Academy quad. Viewing Kirk's actual adventures tells a different story. There were times that he flirted with women in order to get vital information, but Kirk rarely took it farther than that. In fact, Kirk only had romantic encounters in about 25% of the original Trek episodes, and maybe some of the books, and possibly that Tribble in the cartoon, and definitely a few times in the movies.
What is it with you, anyway?
Look, the point is, Kirk is hardly the space pimp people remember. Now, Commander Riker, on the other hand.
With a history spanning nearly 55 years, Star Trek has become a television and film institution. As the decades have rolled by, many of the actors who brought these immortal characters to life have reached the end of their own lives, leaving behind an unforgettable legacy. Here are some Star Trek actors you forgot passed away. Okay, you probably didn't forget this one. Despite possessing a humorless, cold, and logical demeanor, Spock is the heart of all things Trek, and much of the credit for that goes to Leonard Nimoy. When not acting, Nimoy was also a poet, an artist, a photographer, and a musician. And his relationship with the character of Spock could be complicated at times. His first autobiography, for example, was titled I Am Not Spock, whereas the 1995 follow-up was called I Am Spock. He later described himself as feeling a sort of mystical identification with the intellectual pointy-eared alien, once writing that, in Spock, I finally found the best of both worlds, to be widely accepted in public approval, and yet to be able to continue to play the insulated alien through the Vulcan character. To the great sadness of the world's sci-fi fans, Leonard Nimoy passed away in 2015 at the age of 83. His wife, Susan Bay Nimoy, attributed his death to end-stage chronic pulmonary disease. During his twilight years, Nimoy had continued bringing Spock to life as the elderly Spock Prime version of the character in the rebooted Star Trek movies.
Whoa, what are you doing? Our minds, one and together.
To honor his legacy, the 2016 film Star Trek Beyond made a point to write the Vulcan's death into the script, and to show the impact of his demise upon the younger version of the character, then played by Zachary Quinto. The Delta navigator Ilia never got the chance to become a recurring character in Star Trek, but she nonetheless played a key role in Star Trek The Motion Picture. At the time, Ilia's shaved head was a bold statement for cinema, and according to The Independent, she was the first bald heroine in film history. The daring actress who brought her to life was Persis Kambata, an international model from Mumbai who in 1965 had been awarded the title of Miss India. Kambata entered the acting world through an array of Hindi-language films before making her Hollywood debut in the 1975 flick The Wilby Conspiracy, co-starring Sidney Poitier and Michael Caine. Playing Ilia in Star Trek proved to be her breakout performance, eventually leading to her becoming the first ever Indian performer to present an award at the Oscars. However, when she was offered a role in the next James Bond movie, she rejected it out of a vow to her mother that she would return back home. Throughout her life and career, Kambata remained a private person who never sought out the spotlight. Sadly, in 1998, she suffered a fatal heart attack at just 49 years old. In Star Trek history, few deaths have been as tragic or shockingly sad as the accidental loss of Anton Yelchin, who portrayed the young genius Pavel Chekhov in the post-reboot Trek films. The Russian-born actor, known for the boyish charm and quick wit he displays in films like Odd Thomas and Charlie Bartlett, seemed destined for a long and great career. Sadly, it all ended in 2016 when a freak car accident ended his life at the age of 27. The circumstances involved Yelchin's 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee shifting backwards without warning down his driveway. Yelchin was out of the car, and the vehicle trapped his body between his mailbox and security fence, leaving him pinned until he died. The ensuing legal battle between Fiat Chrysler, the makers of Jeep vehicles, and Yelchin's parents went on for years. The family maintained that the SUV's gearshift mechanism had been to blame for their son's death. As it happened, this mechanism had caused a number of other incidents over the years. The two parties reached a settlement in 2018. The Ferengi were some of the funniest characters ever featured on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, known for being the greediest capitalists in a galaxy that had mostly abandoned the concept of money. But the character of young Nog, as played by Aaron Eisenberg, proved that you can never paint all people of a certain culture with the same brush. Contrary to his manipulative Uncle Quark, Nog was a boy who formed a genuine friendship with an Earthling, Jake Sisko, and even went on to become the first Ferengi to join Starfleet. Sadly, while actor Aaron Eisenberg did snag a few other roles over the years, he also suffered through a number of severe health traumas in the decades following his Trek days. Eisenberg endured 2 separate kidney transplant operations, with the second occurring in 2015. Tragically, in late 2019, his wife Melissa Longo shared on Facebook that Eisenberg had passed away at age 50, saying of her late husband, "He was an intelligent, humble, funny, emphatic soul. He sought to live his life with integrity and truth." Always ready, always effective, and always looking out for the little guy, many doctors today have credited Leonard H. Bones McCoy with having inspired them to take the leap and attend medical school. Amusingly enough, while it's now impossible to imagine Bones played by anyone other than DeForest Kelley, Gene Roddenberry initially offered the actor a choice between playing either McCoy or Spock.
I'm not a magician, Spock, just an old country doctor.
In retrospect, Kelley definitely made the right decision. Even after the original series and after the first wave of movies, Kelley went on to serve as the bridge between the 60s crew and the then newcomers featured in Star Trek The Next Generation. The last few years of Kelley's life were plagued by health problems, with his final months spent in a convalescent home in Woodland Hills, California. In 1999, he died at the age of 79 of complications arising from stomach cancer, which he had suffered from for 18 months. As any Star Trek diehard will tell you, the show's original pilot episode, The Cage, was a little different from the series that eventually came around. For one, the commander of the Enterprise was not James Kirk, but rather Christopher Pike. Pike's first officer was a woman named Number One, played by actress Majel Barrett, who was cold, distant, and logical back when Spock was still relatively cheery. However, Number One's high-ranking position on the Enterprise, as well as her calculated demeanor, chafed with NBC producers, so the character was promptly kicked off the bridge. Since then, both Pike and Number One have become fan-favorite characters, courtesy of their revival on Star Trek Discovery, with the latter now portrayed by Rebecca Romijn. Back in the show's early days, Barrett went on to become a major part of Trek history, not just as the wife of creator Gene Roddenberry, but also as the ship's nurse, Christine Chapel. Barrett Roddenberry continued to play Chapel in the movies, and later cut loose as Laxwana Troi on both Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Throughout all of this, she also played the familiar voice of the Enterprise computer throughout various different shows in the franchise. Majel Barrett Roddenberry passed away in late 2008 at the age of 76 after a long battle with leukemia. Brock Peters was a legendary actor, most recognized for playing the wrongly accused man Tom Robinson in the classic adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird. He had many roles over the years, but among Star Trek fans, he is remembered for the 2 unrelated parts he brought to life. First, he portrayed Admiral Cartwright in Star Trek IV The Voyage Home and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country. Second, he entered the world of Deep Space Nine as Creole Master Chef Joseph Sisko. Though Peters' Deep Space Nine appearances were infrequent, his character's energy, positivity, and loving dedication to family were clear influences on his son, Captain Sisko, a character who has since been ranked by many diehard Trekkers as their favorite Star Trek captain of all time. In his old age, Peters came down with pancreatic cancer. It finally took his life in 2005 at the age of 78, when he died at his home in Los Angeles. Arguably the most iconic and powerful single antagonist in all of Star Trek lore is Khan Noonien Singh, a character who first premiered in the original series before his titular comeback in Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan.
Surely I have made my meaning plain. I mean to avenge myself upon you, Admiral.
While Khan's story is interesting enough and surprisingly sympathetic, the secret ingredient behind the character's enduring popularity was the masterful acting ability of Ricardo Montalban. Montalban was one of the pioneering Mexican-born actors in Hollywood who worked hard to overcome the prejudices of his time. When Montalban achieved his own degree of success, he funneled it into his nonprofit, the Nos Ostros Foundation, in an effort to create new opportunities in the motion picture business for fellow Latino professionals. He wasn't afraid to call out executives for only casting him in Brazilian, Cuban, and Argentinian roles, but never as a Mexican character, pointing out how the industry continued to portray Mexican people in a stereotypical and negative manner. Between his passionate activism and his talent, Ricardo Montalban left behind an incredible legacy when he died in his LA home in 2009 at the age of 88. It's hard to imagine the original Star Trek series working without James Doohan's endearing character Scotty manning the Enterprise's transporters. Doohan, who actually hailed from British Columbia, Canada, continued playing Scotty all the way from the original series to Star Trek The Next Generation, where he befriended the new crew in heartwarming fashion. Doohan's lovable persona, tireless enthusiasm, and ability to fix any malady the ship experienced clearly inspired the performances of every Star Trek chief engineer since, from Miles O'Brien to Charles Trip Tucker III. Though Doohan lived a long life, his later years were tragically plagued by the onset of Alzheimer's disease. In 2005, he experienced a bout with pneumonia and passed away at the age of 85. From his role as Father Mulcahy in the original film version of MASH to an unforgettable performance as the villainous chef in Disney's The Little Mermaid, René Auberjonois carved his name into countless different pop culture smash hits over his long career. Perhaps none of his roles, though, were as well loved as Odo, the malleable chief security officer of Deep Space Nine, whom he portrayed for 7 seasons. While Odo's gruff demeanor immediately positioned him as one of the space station's more offbeat characters, the more that Deep Space Nine peeled back Odo's layers, the more endearing he became. Post-Trek, Auberjonois never stopped acting, just recently starring in the 2019 comedy film Raising Buchanan, where he portrayed the 15th U.S. president. Unfortunately, as with so many Star Trek stars, his life was finally claimed by cancer, in his case, cancer of the lungs. To the sadness of fans all over the world, Auberjonois died in 2019 at the age of 79. Alexander Roshenko, the son of Worf, was a boy who went through a great number of changes and actors as he aged from child to adult. The first actor to portray Alexander in Star Trek The Next Generation was a boy named John Paul Stewart, who allegedly nabbed the role because he was the only young man capable of sitting still for 3 hours while all the Klingon makeup and prosthetic pieces were applied. And although Stewart did take a few more roles over the years, he soon decided that acting wasn't his thing and instead became a successful restaurateur, and more prominently, a musician in the band Problems, where he went by the name Johnny Jules. Sadly, on January 5, 2018, Stewart was pronounced dead at the age of 33. The first reports did not reveal the cause of his passing, but later that year, People magazine announced that Stewart's death had been ruled a suicide.
With all the movies and TV series out there, it's no surprise that over the years there have been plenty of mistakes in Star Trek productions. But the mistakes in this list are so big that they're difficult, nay, impossible to ignore. TV shows introduce minor characters without clear backstories all the time, and sometimes those characters prove too popular or useful to just discard. That means the character needs more detail, and sometimes it arrives too fast. Such is the story of Miles O'Brien, who appeared in the first episode of The Next Generation as a nameless crew member working the transporters. According to the collaborative fan site Memory Alpha, O'Brien's rank has at different times been crewman, lieutenant, warrant officer, and ensign junior grade. Eventually, his rank was stabilized as chief petty officer, but even that was never actually mentioned on screen and is just sort of accepted by everyone as canon. O'Brien wasn't initially intended to be a major character. He didn't even get a last name until the second season, and no serious effort was put into his backstory until season 4. He was just a background character, and the writers never had any designs on making him a bigger deal, so they had to make up for it later. While this makes perfect sense in terms of the logistics of producing a television series, sci-fi needs a certain level of authenticity to work, and having a military organization treat a crew member's rank like a random afterthought is almost unforgivable. Picking on production errors isn't always fair. Television shows have to grind out episodes on schedule and on budget after all, and sometimes mistakes just have to be included in the final product. That's especially true when it comes to action scenes. Everyone knows that stunt doubles do a lot of the heavy lifting in action scenes, and nitpicking continuity mistakes that don't really impact the quality of the story or performances seems petty when you consider the decades of entertainment a franchise like Star Trek has given us. But sometimes there are mistakes so violently obvious and terrible that they're enraging. Sure, you can't afford to reshoot every fight scene that doesn't turn out great, but you should probably reshoot a fight scene that turns out as awful as the one between William Riker and Rear Admiral Quinn in the otherwise classic Next Generation episode Conspiracy. In this infamous scene, you can see the stunt doubles pretty clearly for several agonizing seconds. It's as if 2 entirely new actors were hired for the scene midway through filming, with only minimal effort put into making the stunt professionals look anything like the actors they're subbing for. The 2009 reboot of Star Trek brought into the world by J.J. Abrams is essentially set in an alternate universe. While it's arguably a smart narrative choice, some sci-fi magic had to be woven into the story involving a black hole and some time travel in order to get us there. The villain of the film, a Romulan named Nero, blames Spock and the Federation itself for the destruction of his planet, Romulus. As a result, he won't stop his quest for revenge even when his ship is sucked through a black hole which sends him back in time. He almost immediately manages to kill Captain Kirk's father, George, and then does absolutely nothing apparently for a few decades while George's son, James Tiberius, grows up to be the cocky future captain we all know and love.
Nero and his crew spent the next 25 years awaiting my arrival.
Considering he's on a mission of vengeance and in a universe where Romulus hasn't been destroyed yet, you might imagine he could find better uses for his time. As it is, audiences are left questioning what exactly he's been up to for all that time. Apparently, some deleted scenes originally showed Nero captured by Klingons, but we never got to see them. You can choose to include those scenes as canon in your head, but the fact remains that the official story leaves Nero hanging out in deep space, sulking for 20 years or so. It's almost comically common for New Zealand to be left off of maps. So you'd think that the producers of a major motion picture predicated on the idea that mankind has expanded civilization into space would be very careful in choosing the maps used in special effects shots. But you'd be wrong. In the film First Contact, Captain Jean-Luc Picard takes a character named Lily to an airlock and shows her Earth from the ship's location in space. Australia is clearly shown, but in the spot where New Zealand should be, it's just blue ocean. Obviously, someone in the effects department picked up a crummy map image to create the effect. You might be tempted to explain it away as future climate change or some other disaster, except that New Zealand is referenced many times in the Trek universe, so that doesn't work. It's just a mistake that, once seen, can't be unseen. While Star Trek isn't above inventing things like dilithium crystals or playing fast and loose with the laws of physics, it tends towards reasonably realistic depictions of space travel and life on board massive ships. No one's watching Star Trek for the science education, though it usually doesn't outright offend. The exception is one sequence in 2009's Star Trek which boasts science so bad that even the most forgiving fan has to wince and squint their way through it. The scene has Spock standing on the planet Delta Vega watching as his home planet, Vulcan, is consumed by a black hole. That's essentially the same as if you were standing in your backyard watching as Mars got consumed by a black hole, meaning you wouldn't really see an up-close view, and that's ignoring what would happen to Delta Vega itself if it was really that close to the formation of a black hole. Spock simply wouldn't be able to see what he's seeing in the film. Captain Christopher Pike is only slightly less iconic to fans than the famous Star Trek captains Kirk, Picard, Sisko, and Janeway. He was the first captain of the USS Enterprise in the original pilot episode, returned in the classic two-part episode The Menagerie, late in the first season, and has been rebooted as a character several times. The 2009 Star Trek reboot imagined Pike as a veteran officer who inspires James T. Kirk to enter Starfleet Academy. Portrayed by Bruce Greenwood, this version of Pike is sort of an ideal Starfleet officer, calm, ethical, and smart. So it's especially upsetting when Pike says the following while trying to convince Kirk to follow in his father's heroic footsteps.
You understand what the Federation is, don't you? It's important. It's a peacekeeping and humanitarian armada.
The problem? That's not actually what the Federation is. That's what Starfleet is. The Federation is an interplanetary governing body. So, yeah, it kind of ruins the moment and undermines the gravitas that Captain Pike's character had been earning. It makes you wonder how in the world Pike passed his entrance exams if he can't even get the fundamental definitions right. Star Trek established several technologies in its universe that are potentially problematic. The replicators can make just about anything. The holodeck can create immersive illusions and characters that can achieve sentience and affect reality. But the biggest problem is the transporter. The transporter is shown to have the ability to rewrite people's DNA in the Next Generation episode Unnatural Selection. In 1979's Star Trek The Motion Picture, a horrific transporter accident shows the flip side of this capability. And yet, this power, which could be used in an infinite number of ways, is never mentioned again. It's possible the implications of what the transporter can do to human bodies discourage the writers from exploring it further. Just as likely is the fact that having a magic machine that can reset anyone to yesterday's version was simply too powerful to have lying around. In the original series episode The Squire of Gothos, the otherworldly character of Trelane tells the crew of the Enterprise that he's been observing Earth. They do some back-of-the-envelope calculations regarding the distance between the planets and conclude that Trelane is about 900 years behind Earth history. In other words, because it takes time for light to travel, Trelane is essentially seeing Earth's past. That's all well and good, but the original series canonically takes place in the 23rd century, and the first season of the original series takes place in the year 2265 specifically. That would mean Trelane is observing 14th century Earth, but he's explicitly aware of Napoleon and the American Revolution, so he must be watching the early 1800s. So these Starfleet officers are either absolute trash at basic math, absolute trash at basic physics, or absolute trash at Earth history. The Wrath of Khan rescued the Star Trek film franchise after the motion picture failed to get people terribly excited. A sequel to a classic original series episode, Space Seed, it delivered a thrilling story that addressed the crew's oncoming middle age and offered some iconic backstory for Captain Kirk. Plus, there's some absolutely incredible scenery chewing from Ricardo Montalban. But it also has a mistake you just can't ignore and maintain your sanity. When Pavel Chekhov meets Khan Noonien Singh on Sati Alpha 5, Khan and Chekhov clearly recognize each other from the Enterprise's earlier interactions with the late 20th century Superman. The problem? Chekhov wasn't even a character on the show yet when Space Seed aired, and thus he never met Khan on screen. While you can imagine that Chekhov was a crew member and interacted with Khan off-screen if you want, it's simply a mistake the writers either didn't notice or chose to ignore for dramatic effect. One of the most iconic aspects of the future imagined by Gene Roddenberry is the ship's computer, which has the ability to talk to the crew. One of the reasons the computer on the Enterprise was such an iconic part of the show is thanks to the voice work of Majel Barrett Roddenberry, Gene Roddenberry's wife, who provided the voice of the ship's computer for decades. Her voice work was fantastic, managing to give the computer some personality while still sounding very computer-like. However, there was one huge problem with the computer's voice, especially during the Next Generation. Sometimes production forgot to edit out the sounds of the very human actor doing things like breathing, something a computer would probably not do. For example, in one scene in the pilot episode of Star Trek Voyager, Lieutenant Tom Paris asks a replicator to list the varieties of tomato soup it can produce, and you can clearly hear the computer take a breath while rattling off the menu.
Varieties of tomato soup available from this replicator, with rice.
The currently accepted model of the universe pegs the speed of light as the upper limit when it comes to zooming around in space. Of course, you can forgive a sci-fi franchise like Star Trek for hand-waving the laws of physics a bit. No one wants the Enterprise to take 60 years just to get to its first mission, after all, and so they came up with the warp drive.
The ship's space warp ability, gone. Earth bases, which were only days away, are now years in the distance.
While warp speed has never been precisely defined, scientist James O'Donoghue did some calculating and concluded that warp 1 is essentially light speed, and warps 2 through 10 are just faster somehow. That's all well and good, but the real problem is in the details. For example, if the Enterprise is chasing another ship, and that ship drops out of warp 1 second earlier, the Enterprise is suddenly tens of thousands of miles away from it. Just 1 second of warp time means vast distances, which doesn't make for an exciting space battle. One of the pleasures of Star Trek is its thoughtful exploration of sci-fi tropes, and the android Data is one of the most successful such ruminations in its history. Data allows the franchise to explore questions of sentience, free will, and spirituality in intelligent and unexpected ways, while also allowing for a lot of really bad robot jokes. However, one of the worst mistakes the Next Generation writers made was establishing that Data, as an android, couldn't use contractions due to programming limitations. It's something they waited 12 episodes until Data Lore to bring up. On the one hand, this lent Data a slightly off-center formality that underscored his inhumanity. On the other hand, according to co-star Will Wheaton, this was a new idea the writers introduced in order to distinguish Data from Lore, the other android who looked just like Data. Actor Brent Spiner was apparently upset at the sloppy way it was being introduced, especially since Data had used contractions in previous episodes. Later in the series, the writers dropped the idea that Data couldn't use contractions, and there are, of course, plenty of possible explanations for the shift. But in the early going, this was an obvious and grating mistake born out of a nifty concept that no one really committed to.
Star Trek is known as a franchise that blends sci-fi adventure with thought-provoking storylines, but the crew of the Enterprise isn't afraid to get a little emotional too. As these tear-jerking moments prove, Star Trek doesn't just make its audiences think, it makes them cry. In Star Trek III, Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise have stolen their own ship from Starfleet and have taken it to the forbidden Genesis planet. The reason? Dr. McCoy is carrying around the deceased Spock's Katra, essentially the Trek equivalent of a soul, and Kirk is determined to retrieve Spock's body and bring his Vulcan pal back to life. Unfortunately, Klingons board the ship and are about to take it over, so Kirk makes the most difficult choice of his long career and orders the Enterprise to self-destruct. After beaming down to the Genesis planet, the crew watches the remains of the exploded ship slowly burn up in the atmosphere. And if the sight of the beloved starship disintegrating doesn't make you tear up, their conversation just might.
My God, Bones. What have I done?
For both viewers and its crew, losing that ship felt like the loss of a family member, and the prolonged scene definitely milks the drama of the event for all it's worth, and gets quite a few tears from the audience in the process. Star Trek Voyager took the idea of a ragtag crew about as far as it could go, mixing a crew of thieves and rebels with prim and proper Starfleet officers. Perhaps no one embodied that idea as much as the alien native of the Delta Quadrant, Neelix. He ends up joining Voyager and becoming the ship's resident chef and morale officer, both jobs that were thought to be obsolete, but necessary for a crew lost in the furthest reaches of space with no easy way home. Neelix used his natural ingenuity to feed the ship for 7 years and established himself as the heart of the crew. When he finally left to rejoin a settlement of his own people, it was secretly one of Trek's saddest moments. Neelix tries to quietly walk to the transporter room, but what seems to be the entire crew is standing in the hallways as kind of an honor guard as he walks through. Captain Janeway calls the often silly Neelix ambassador, and the ever-serious Vulcan Tuvok briefly demonstrates that he's willing to dance in Neelix's honor. Seeing the crew like this really highlights the difference that Neelix has made in their lives, and after he leaves the ship, we see him embraced, a confirmation that Neelix, who has often been lost and lonely, has finally found his way to a place he can truly call home. If you were picking which characters would hook up when Star Trek Deep Space Nine started, Odo and Kira would probably be your absolute last choice of couples. He was the gruff, shape-shifting constable who had worked on the space station when Cardassians ruled, and Kira was a straight-up former freedom fighter who had dedicated her life to driving those same Cardassians off her home planet. In the episode Heart of Stone, Kira and Odo end up on a strange planet while chasing after a rebel. They split up to find him, and when Odo sees Kira again, she's in a bizarre crystalline trap that's expanding and threatening her life. At the same time, mysterious tremors are shaking the planet and threatening them both. Kira tries to order Odo to leave so they don't both die, and when she asks him why he won't return to the ship, he finally confesses his true feelings.
With you.
With that out in the open, Kira tearfully admits that she loves him too, and at this point, audiences are crying right along with her. Don't get too happy though. Before long, the episode twists the knife in our hearts in classic Deep Space Nine fashion. Kira is actually a shapeshifter who, as the rebel, has lured Odo out there to bring him to his own people, the Sinister Dominion. Odo refuses and retrieves the real Kira, who is completely unaware that Odo's love for her is so great that he's willing to die for her. From his one-night stand with Tasha Yar to the trial to determine his right to exist, Data's attempts at learning to be more human provided some of Star Trek The Next Generation's most memorable moments. None of them, however, were quite as heartrending as what happened in The Offspring, a third-season episode where he attempts to create an android child of his own. While Lal is more than a little terrifying at first, she quickly becomes endearing, and by the time a Starfleet admiral shows up to question Data's fitness as a father and whether the android officer has the right to keep his child on board, we're fully on the android's side. Unfortunately, while the admiral is proven completely wrong, it happens in one of the saddest scenes in the series. Data's child begins to develop emotions, something Data himself could never do, but her positronic brain burns out, leading inevitably to her death. The scene where Data says goodbye to his dying daughter is utterly crushing. Lal expresses her love, and when Data reluctantly admits he cannot experience that feeling with her, she vows to feel enough for both of them. With that, her speech degrades into random words and she dies before our very eyes, leaving Data once again alone in the universe. Well, except for the occasional visit from his murderous evil brother. Denise Crosby's one-season run as Tasha Yar in Star Trek The Next Generation wasn't really that notable. While having a female officer in charge of security was a relatively bold move for 1987, she was constantly overwritten or underwritten and wound up dying in the most undignified way possible when she was casually killed by a malevolent alien puddle named Armus. That moment was too weird and abrupt to be sad, but the episode made up for it with a surprisingly moving memorial scene on the holodeck. Her hologram appears as part of a pre-made program. She declares that the crew is her family and that they transformed her from an angry young girl to the woman she became. She even has a personalized message for Captain Picard about how much she admires him.
I could say you've been like a father to me. but I've never had one, so I don't know what it feels like.
Data comments that even though the ceremony is supposed to be about Tasha, he cannot stop thinking about himself, specifically how empty his life will be without Tasha in it. Oblivious to human emotion, he asks Picard if he has missed the point of the ceremony. Picard responds that this is exactly the point of the memorial and walks away, leaving us with the last lingering notes of the saddest music Star Trek The Next Generation ever brought to the screen. The City on the Edge of Forever is one of the most memorable episodes of the original Star Trek, both for its high-concept premise and for giving the show one of its saddest moments. Dr. McCoy accidentally overdoses on drugs right as the Enterprise is visiting a planet with one inhabitant, a talking portal to all of time and space called the Guardian of Forever. Still freaking out, McCoy jumps through the portal into the past, leaving the crew of the Enterprise with a huge problem. The Enterprise is no longer in orbit due to something McCoy has done in the distant past, so Kirk and Spock go back to stop history from breaking. They end up in 1930s New York. In classic Kirk fashion, he ends up falling in love with a woman there named Edith Keeler. But as horrible fate would have it, McCoy's time-breaking act was simply saving Keeler from dying in an accident. In the new timeline, Keeler became a pacifist leader and successfully kept America out of World War II, which ended up giving Nazi Germany enough time to create nuclear bombs and take over the world. As a result, Starfleet got seriously messed up. Soon after, Kirk and Spock are finally reunited with McCoy, and an oblivious Keeler crosses the street to meet them. When a truck starts heading toward her, Kirk fights the urge to save her, letting the woman he loves die. McCoy is horrified, saying he could have saved her and asking Kirk if he knows what he just did. Kirk, meanwhile, can't stop staring at the dead body as Spock replies,
"What you just did?" He knows, Doctor. He knows.
The fittingly named Star Trek The Next Generation episode Lower Decks gave us a glimpse of the junior officers that the show typically uses simply as background characters. We get a special emphasis on a Bajoran named Sito, an ensign constantly challenged by Picard and Worf to get her to stand up for herself. It turns out that this is their roundabout way of testing whether she was suitable for an undercover mission behind enemy lines. Sito agrees to the difficult mission but never returns home, having died in action, leading to an incredibly moving speech from Picard.
The finest example of a Starfleet officer, and a young woman of remarkable courage and strength of character.
The reaction shot of her various friends as they find out she is dead goes straight to the heart, as does the final shot of Picard. He seems to crumple in his seat, seeming less like a powerful starship captain and more like a tired, aging father realizing that he cannot protect his children. Ever since Mr. Spock got riled up over Ponfar, Star Trek has always enjoyed toying with the emotions of people who aren't supposed to have them. After spending 13 years as a Borg drone, Star Trek Voyager's liberated 7 of 9 was super messed up. She had no idea how to be human, and she was really bad at interacting with other people. Her social awkwardness was both embarrassing and endearing, and it was also a big part of why she was such a popular character. It was a very thoughtful show after all, so her skin-tight catsuits clearly had nothing to do with it.
Sexually aroused in my body.
7 of 9 had a difficult time relating to the other people around her, so when she got the opportunity to take another renegade Borg drone named 1 under her wing, she became a sort of mother figure to him. Sadly, the relationship was doomed, of course, and when 1 accidentally contacted the Borg Collective, he decided that the only way to save 7 and the crew of Voyager was to terminate himself. The Doctor tried to save him, but 1 refused help, despite 7's gut-wrenching pleas.
Comply. Please. You are hurting me.
7's confusion about 1's death and her own feelings is palpable and really, really sad. Just as she's discovering her maternal instincts, she's forced to confront maternal grief. Of all the emotional moments in Star Trek history, there's one that stands out above every other one as the most devastating of all time: the crushing, heartbreaking death of Spock in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. It's generally regarded as the single best moment in the best Star Trek film. If you're one of the 3 people left in the universe who hasn't seen this one, Spock sacrifices himself in a radiation-flooded chamber in order to give the Enterprise the ability to escape from the about-to-explode Genesis device. Once he's taken a lethal dose of radiation, an incapacitated Spock somehow manages to struggle to his feet and still has the presence of mind to arrange his uniform to make sure he's up to Starfleet standards in his last moments. In his final words to his best friend, Spock tells him that sacrificing his own life to save his friends, his crewmates, and his ship was the only logical choice.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
If that didn't have you sobbing, then the funeral that comes after definitely will. William Shatner's over-the-top acting has been the punchline of plenty of jokes, but the way his voice breaks when he delivers Spock's eulogy is genuinely heartbreaking. Spock would return, of course, but nothing can take the raw emotional power away from this nearly perfect scene. Believe it or not, Star Trek's sci-fi escapades have often been based on actual events that happened here on Earth. Let's boldly go where no fan has gone before and look at some of the true stories that inspired Star Trek. Star Trek loves to talk about politics and social justice, but at the same time, the original series seemed to contradict the message. What with its long track record of ditzy women in impossibly short skirts who lack any sort of self-reliance or tenacity. If you've ever found that annoying, it might comfort you to know that Star Trek writers Herb Solow and Robert Justman often used racy content to distract TV censors of the time from the show's otherwise political content. In the second season episode, A Private Little War, Kirk contemplates the ethics of intervening in someone else's war, a fairly controversial subject for the time.
We are wise enough to know that we are wise enough not to interfere in the way of a man or another world.
During the episode, he kisses a partially dressed woman with an open mouth, no less. That particular scene was actually written for the purpose of drawing attention away from the episode's storyline, which was a thinly veiled commentary on whether or not the United States should get involved in Vietnam. It was a pretty genius move, and it worked. The episode aired in February 1968, just after the launch of the Tet Offensive. Over a century after Jack the Ripper stopped terrorizing the Whitechapel district of London, we still can't stop talking about him. He's been featured in films, television shows, comic books, video games, and pretty much every other type of media you can think of. And for some reason, Star Trek used Jack the Ripper as inspiration for the 1967 episode Wolf in the Fold. A woman causes an accident that gives Scotty a concussion, so Kirk and McCoy take him to a pleasure planet that winds up looking rather suspiciously like the Whitechapel district of London circa 1888. While they're down there, women keep getting killed, and Scotty keeps getting found holding a bloody knife, so things are not looking good for everybody's favorite engineer.
Under Argelian jurisdiction, if they want to arrest him, try him, even convict him, I have to go along with it. But he's suffering from a severe concussion.
In case you're worried, Scotty isn't the killer. If he were, we would have missed out on decades of his charming Scottish brogue.
What are you standing around for? Do you not know a jailbreak when you see one?
No, the real killer is the actual Jack the Ripper, who, as it turns out, is a formless entity that needs fear and also foggy streets to survive. What a relief. Not every based on a true story Star Trek episode is meant to be a complex political allegory on truth and justice. Some are written simply for the purpose of being silly and entertaining. Some aren't even based on true stories. Instead, they're inspired by conspiracy theories that are probably just nonsense. Season 4 of Deep Space Nine tackles the complex social problem of people who actually think the government might be hiding aliens at Area 51. In Little Green Men, Quark, Rom, Odo, and Nog are accidentally sent back in time to Area 51.
The 20th century? You mean we traveled back through time? More than 400 years!
The episode handily explains the 1947 crash of the high-altitude balloon that spawned decades of conspiracy theories and culminated in the 2019 storming of Area 51 for what it really was: the crash of a Ferengi shuttle piloted by a race of super-capitalist humanoid aliens with very large ears. Sometimes it takes a big thing to shine a light on important social problems. Before the riot at Attica Prison in 1971, many American inmates were kept in deplorable conditions. At Attica, prisoners were allotted 1 shower a week and 1 roll of toilet paper a month. Things came to a head when the prisoners rebelled, taking hostages and releasing a list of demands. Notably, the prisoners' list of demands didn't include let us out of prison. It was mostly just a plea for humane conditions, including religious freedom, an end to censorship of their personal correspondence, and better living conditions.
They've forgotten about us.
So what do?
We make them remember.
The Attica riot changed prisoner treatment in America and was the inspiration for a key incident in Deep Space Nine's 2-part episode Past Tense. In this time-traveling episode, writer Ira Behr drew from the Attica prison riot when constructing the 2024 Bell riots, an incident in which the occupants of a repressive sanctuary district for homeless and unemployed people rebel. As far as Star Trek's Earth is concerned, the event helped usher humans toward the peaceful, post-scarcity society enjoyed by Kirk and friends. The Troubles is a phrase used to describe the conflict in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 1998. While the mostly Protestant Unionists wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, the mostly Catholic nationalists, led by the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, wanted to join the Republic of Ireland. The confrontation resulted in the deaths of around 3,600 people. Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3 episode The High Ground is about a violent conflict between the people of the planet of Rutia 4 and a bomb-planting group of rebel separatists called Ansata. The parallels between Ansata and the IRA are so thinly veiled that Data and Picard actually have an on-screen conversation about the parallels between Ansata and the IRA. Data even says the conflict in Northern Ireland is an example of successful terrorism.
I've been reviewing the history of armed rebellion, and it appears that terrorism is an effective way to promote political change.
The episode aired in 1990 when the real conflict was still very much a thing, and the content was alarming enough to the British powers of TV that it was heavily edited in the United Kingdom and Ireland, which included the removal of the Data Picard conversation. As of 2019, it has still never been shown in its entirety on the Emerald Isle. Star Trek's habit of drawing on real life sometimes even dips into medical mysteries of the past in order to flesh out a character or just add some depth to a storyline. One such example is the similarity between the memory condition suffered by Captain Archer in the Enterprise episode Twilight and the story of a real-life medical case from 1953. In the show, Archer suffers from a disorder caused by parasites that live in non-linear time, which causes all new memories to fade within hours.
They haven't caused any tissue damage, but they're impairing certain synaptic functions. They're preventing you from forming new, long-term memories.
The storyline seems to be based on the case of Henry Malayason, a 27-year-old assembly worker who suffered from severe epilepsy. Malayason underwent brain surgery to remove his hippocampus, and his seizures stopped, but he also lost the ability to form new memories. Malayason could remember some things from the past, but nothing from the moment he emerged from the surgery. In the Deep Space Nine episode Far Beyond the Stars, Sisko is given a vision by a bunch of mysterious wormhole aliens. In the vision, he's living in 1950s Harlem, working as a sci-fi writer. During his time in his dream, he deals with racist publishers who refuse to publish his story on the grounds that it has a black protagonist, and he encounters various characters who look an awful lot like his crewmates back home. Fortunately, the episode is blissfully free from ruby slippers and talking scarecrows.
But it wasn't a dream.
It seems likely that the episode was inspired by the Comics Code Authority's 1956 decision to disallow the publication of an entertaining comic story titled Judgment Day, which featured a black protagonist. Judge Charles Murphy said outright that he wouldn't even approve the story if it had a black protagonist. Entertaining Comics published it anyway, even though its lack of official approval meant that it wouldn't get wide distribution.
Oh, I like it all right. It's good. It's very good. But you know I can't print it.
Why not?
Oh, come on, Benny.
After that, Murphy embarked on a personal vendetta against the publisher, personally reviewing everything they submitted for approval. The company went out of business a few years later. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655. The incident happened toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War while the Vincennes was exchanging fire with Iranian ships in the Persian Gulf. The official U.S. Navy account of the incident said the passenger plane was mistaken for an enemy jet. Still, 279 civilian passengers and crew members died when the Vincennes shot 2 surface-to-air missiles at the plane. In the Deep Space Nine episode Rules of Engagement, Worf has been accused of a similar crime, destroying a civilian ship carrying 441 people. Much of the episode is a courtroom drama in which the Klingon Empire is trying to get Worf extradited for war crimes, and Sisko is trying to stop that from happening. The story ends predictably. As it turns out, the whole thing was just a setup, and Worf actually fired on a ship full of dead bodies.
Possible that the ship he saw was sending out false sensor images, and that this whole affair was staged, so that the only—
As for the real-life incident, well, it's unfortunately not that black and white. Real people died on Air Flight 655, and we probably won't ever know exactly what happened. Star Trek often has the uncanny ability to address problems that we're still discussing decades later. In the original series episode, The Ultimate Computer, the Enterprise becomes the proud owner of a new computer called the M5, which is capable of running all the ship's systems with minimal human intervention. This is immediately not cool as far as Kirk and McCoy are concerned, though Spock is predictably fascinated by the idea.
I don't like it, Jim. A vessel this size cannot be run by one computer.
We are attempting to prove that it can run this ship more efficiently than man.
You can probably see the ending coming from several million light years away. M5 isn't really the ultimate computer, it's the ultimate killing machine. In a mock battle meant to demonstrate its abilities, M5 takes down another starship with lethal force. When Kirk convinces it that it's a killer, it shuts itself down, thus preventing a Skynet-style takeover of the Federation. The episode was a reaction to the rise of the computer and genuine concern about what would happen if we gave machines too much power and control. It deals with questions we still ask ourselves today, like what happens when human beings automate everything and then everyone is left without a job and a purpose.
20? I can't run a starship with 20 crew.
The M5 can.
And what am I supposed to do?
Over the years, Star Trek has asked plenty of questions about war, territory, and unprovoked attacks. The Enterprise incident, a third-season episode of the original series, was based on the Pueblo incident of 1968, which involved an American communications monitoring ship and some North Korean naval vessels. The Koreans claimed the USS Pueblo was in Korean waters, while the US claimed it was in international waters. After the Koreans opened fire and then boarded the ship, they caught the captain destroying electronics and documents. The crew was brought back to North Korea, where they endured 11 months of interrogation and torture. The Star Trek version of this story is almost exactly the same. The Enterprise is just outside of the Romulan neutral zone on an observation mission when a bunch of Romulan ships show up and open fire, forcing Kirk to surrender. Before the crew is taken prisoner, Kirk orders the destruction of top-secret equipment. Then he and Spock are taken to a Romulan outpost where they're threatened with interrogation and torture.
But there are Romulan methods completely effective against humans and human weaknesses.
After that, the two plot lines diverge somewhat. Spock and Kirk fake their deaths, and then Kirk and McCoy put on pointy-ear disguises, which is evidently enough to make the Romulans not recognize them, so they can infiltrate the Romulan outpost. But we're gonna guess that none of those last bits happened during the real incident. Star Trek couldn't pass up an opportunity to comment on the Cold War in general and Chernobyl in particular. So, nearly 3 decades before HBO's Chernobyl miniseries became a gleam in the eye of some cable TV executive, Star Trek was busy creating an allegory on the incident with Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. In the film, there's a major explosion at an energy facility on Praxis, the Klingon moon. Like the Russians, the Klingons pretend the accident is no big deal, because if they admit otherwise, they admit weakness, and not being weak is like the Klingons' whole deal. In The Undiscovered Country, the Klingon Chancellor even has a familiar name, Garkon. In case you need a nudge, that kinda sounds like Gorbachev. Garkon decides to open peace talks with the Federation, and there's even talk of dismantling the starbases and other military structures around the neutral zone. The real storyline and the fake one start to diverge at this point, because no one would like the movie if the starbases came down and if everyone had a party. Or would they?
Star Trek writers and executives have had a lot of ideas, but most get red-shirted before they hit the airwaves. It's too bad because some sounded awesome. Here are some great Star Trek projects we never got to see. In 1992, the city of Las Vegas drew up an ambitious and, we have to say it, enterprising plan to bring more families to the Strip and boost the gambling revenue. They would pull tourists away from the flashier casinos with a full-size model of the Starship Enterprise. The original plan spared no expense. The Enterprise would be built exactly to the fictional specifications of the TV show, omitting, unfortunately, the phasers and photon torpedoes, making it look like the old gal plopped down right in the middle of Vegas. Guests could tour the ship and witness faithful reproductions of the sets from the TV shows and movies, and with no exterior supports to keep the reproduction faithful, the ship was a minor engineering miracle, something that would have made even Scotty proud. So what happened? Basically, Paramount killed the project for being too audacious. According to the Paramount CEO, if they made a bad movie,
Reroute emergency power to inertial dampers.
The auto sequencer was damaged by phaser fire.
Transferring controls to manual.
Everybody would forget about it in a year. If this tourist trap didn't pan out, however, it'd be around forever. That was the nail in the coffin. Vegas went with the less spectacular Fremont Street experience, and millions of Star Trek fans cried more than they did when Spock died. Less than a year after Star Trek premiered, the show was already in trouble, and Gene Roddenberry had no clue whether his show would survive. Preparing for the worst, he started developing a new show called Assignment Earth. At first, Assignment Earth had nothing to do with Star Trek. It told the story of Gary 7, a time traveler who traveled to the past to make sure Earth history ran the way it was supposed to. Accompanied by a present-day secretary, a supercomputer, and a shape-shifting cat, 7 would fight off evil aliens trying to mess up Earth history.
Mind telling me who that is?
That, Miss Lincoln, is simply my cat.
Fortunately, or not, depending on how stoked you are about a show that was basically Trek meets Doctor Who, The tides eventually turned, and Roddenberry soon realized he could only get the new show going if it was connected to Star Trek. He retooled the idea as a spin-off, making the dubious decision to use an episode of Star Trek as a backdoor pilot for the proposed series. This ended up being the second season finale of Star Trek, basically ending the season as an advertisement for a different TV show with an episode barely featuring Kirk and Spock. To add salt to the wound, NBC passed on the series, making the lame crossover episode even worse. Since the 90s, fans have wanted to see what the Federation was like after The Next Generation. We'll finally be seeing a little of it when Star Trek Picard hits in 2020, but CBS almost gave us what we wanted in 2006 with the groundbreaking Star Trek Final Frontier. Instead of a live-action TV show, Final Frontier was a web-only animated series by Zero Room Productions, exploring the dark future of the Federation centuries after Picard and his crew. During a war with the Romulan Empire, mysterious explosions of Omega particles rendered huge chunks of space impossible to travel via warp, essentially cutting the Federation in half. Anybody trapped in these regions of space would take hundreds of years to travel anywhere else, which stranded starships, including a rundown Enterprise, in vast nothingness. Even worse, political instability forced the Vulcans to leave the Federation, destroyed the Andorians, and allowed the Romulans to occupy the Klingon Empire. It's not exactly the utopian future viewers were used to, but CBS wanted to parallel the global upheavals following 9/11. Eventually, though, the network lost interest, which is probably for the best. When it's all you see on the news, most people don't want to think about the miserable realities of global conflict and terrorism when they watch Star Trek. The proposed designs and storyboards made it online, though, and it turns out that those are actually pretty good. When you never actually make the show, it's pretty hard to screw it up. Before J.J. Abrams rebooted the franchise on the big screen, Paramount was looking at developing Star Trek: The Beginning, a darker take set during the Earth-Romulan War decades before the original series. The Romulans conduct a gigantic sneak attack on Earth and, in a not-so-subtle reference to the Nazis, demand that all Vulcans are turned over to Romulan extermination camps. The United Federation of Planets sends Tiberius Chase, a hotshot pilot and ancestor to Kirk, out on a secret war against the Romulan fleet. Unsurprisingly, the show had some truly insane elements. Tiberius Chase's family are a bunch of xenophobes living in Antarctica, and Paramount wanted to play up the obvious Holocaust parallels. With Tiberius conducting a guerrilla war against the Romulans, it seems like this was a mixture of Inglourious Basterds and Star Trek, and if done well, that could actually be pretty awesome. Eventually, though, Paramount decided The Beginning was a little too dark, and the project was shelved. Instead, Paramount went for J.J. Abrams and the opposite of darkness, lens flares.
No other television show has boldly gone quite so many places as Star Trek. The series may have only been on the air for 3 seasons, but there's some really entertaining stories about the shenanigans that happened on set. Here are some bizarre things that happened on the set of Star Trek. Tinnitus plagues 50 million Americans, and it's one of those things that's a lot worse than it sounds. Tinnitus is the medical term for a ringing in the ears that never goes away, and some special effects caused 2 key Star Trek cast members to experience it. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were both standing too close to a special effects explosion during the filming of the first season Star Trek episode Arena. For years, both men suffered from tinnitus, but it was especially debilitating for Shatner. The actor wrote, "There were days when I didn't know how I would survive the agony. I was so tormented by the screeching in my head, I really thought I would not be able to go on." He eventually found relief with what's known as tinnitus retraining therapy, which requires patients to wear a noise-generating device that teaches the brain to ignore the ringing sound. The therapy worked, and Shatner says he no longer suffers from the disorder. Today, William Shatner has a reputation as being a pretty mellow guy who isn't afraid to make fun of himself. But during the early years of Star Trek, he was kind of a diva. When the producers told the cast the show would feature the world's first televised interracial kiss, they'd already decided it would be between Spock and Uhura, which would have made it the world's first human and alien kiss as well. Shatner was not having it. In his mind, if there was going to be a first anything on Star Trek, he needed to be a part of that. Evidently, the show's producers felt bullied by their spoiled star, so they rewrote the scene to make that first interracial kiss between Kirk and Uhura instead. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, later told the Vancouver Sun, "Bill wanted to rehearse all the time. He said he wanted to get this right. I said to him, it's right. I promise you, it's right." And the camera was shaking and the director was laughing his head off. We had a really good time.
And we're laughing, in between every cut, he's doing things like, "I told you I'm going to get you one day." No, you didn't.
The Enterprise was no stranger to infestations. There were those adorable, if totally featureless and personality-free, tribbles. Then there was that weird infestation of short-lived humans known as red shirts. There were a couple of non-fiction infestations, too.
The ship. I don't care if it takes every man we've got. I want them off the ship.
Pigeons infiltrated the set during the filming of the first pilot. The birds were nesting in the rafters, and they had the annoying habit of cooing whenever then lead Jeffrey Hunter had a line. The crew tried to shoo them away, but they kept flying into the equipment. They were finally able to lure the pigeons off set with breadcrumbs. That wouldn't be the last time the set was infiltrated by pests, though. A colony of bees swarmed the set during the filming of the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah! Open my eyes! Eyes! Ah!
The bees, or wasps depending on the story, descended during the 5th day of production, terrorizing the cast and crew. William Shatner was stung on the eyelid, which you can spot if you watch the episode closely. There was no such thing as CGI in the 1960s, so if you were going to have a scene with a tiger, you had to have a scene with a tiger. That was the plan for the 1966 episode Shore Leave, but not everyone thought it was a great idea. Shatner, though, wasn't just cool with the idea. He thought Captain Kirk should possibly wrestle the tiger until the beast got loose and, quote, went berserk. But once he actually saw it, Shatner changed his mind about the whole wrestling thing. The actor later recalled, "Instantly my testicles rose up into my Adam's apple, and the ignorant machismo that had been pulsing so heartily through my veins was replaced by sheer abject terror. I stood there trying not to look too horrified as I gracefully backed down from wrestling the tiger for the good of the show." Imagine you wheel your grocery cart up to the automatic doors at the store, and said doors just fail to open. That, minus the grocery cart, was pretty much a reality for the actors on the original Star Trek. The reason the doors failed so spectacularly is because they weren't really automatic. They were just operated by a pair of stagehands. They usually failed because one or both stagehands missed their cue and didn't open them in time. It happens so frequently there is actually an entire blooper reel containing nothing but William Shatner walking into the automatic doors. The sliding door problem was never really overcome either. It continued to plague Star Trek productions through subsequent incarnations of the franchise. Star Trek has come a long way in terms of its portrayal of women, but in the early days, female characters weren't exactly known to have much depth. Actress Terry Garr played a ditzy secretary in the second season finale Assignment Earth, and it's a role she has since come to despise. The reason, though, is still something of a mystery. Garr evidently disliked being on Star Trek so much that more than 20 years after her appearance, she still didn't want to talk about it. When Starlog magazine tried to ask her questions about that long-ago role, she became annoyed and told the interviewer, "I have nothing to say about it. I did that years ago, and I mostly deny I ever did it." Assignment Earth was initially meant to be the pilot for a spin-off series, but it didn't get picked up, much to Garr's unabashed pleasure. She told Starlog, "Thank God. Otherwise, all I would get would be Star Trek questions for the rest of my natural life, and probably my unnatural life." You ever see those people who are Star Trek fans? The same people who go to swap meets. Low blow, Garr. Low blow. William Shatner may have acted like a spoiled brat through the 60s, but he wasn't the only one. In fact, Shatner and Leonard Nimoy at one point had a huge, mutually bratty rivalry that escalated to the point where they once both locked themselves in their dressing rooms and refused to come out. George Takei told the story to Howard Stern in 2010 and explained how the whole row was over a photographer. When Shatner found out that a photographer had showed up on set to photograph Nimoy, he decided it was within his authority to kick the photographer out. Takei explained, "Then a group of suits came in and go to Bill's dressing room and spend about 15 minutes there and then go to Leonard's dressing room. We'd see the suits going back and forth from one dressing room to another." As for Shatner kicking the photographer off set, Takei said his contract actually gave him free rein to do it. It turns out that Bill had, in his contract, an approval of a photographer on the set, and he exercised that. Leonard Nimoy got more fan mail than any other Star Trek cast member, and because he was a pretty decent guy, he actually made an effort to respond to his fans. In fact, Nimoy had so much mail to respond to that he once asked the studio for pens and pencils so he could spend his off time answering fan mail. You'd think the studio would have been happy to comply, but it was just the opposite. They refused to pay for the actor's office supplies. The whole affair eventually turned into a series of memos in which associate producer Robert Justman said he'd been knocked unconscious by what he described as a fiercely vice-like grip upon me somewhere between my neck and shoulders. Shortly thereafter, Justman discovered that the supplies cabinet had been robbed, but no one seems to remember if the studio ever went on to get Nimoy some pens. It's time to face the sticky truth. Spock liked lollipops. Don't worry, it was all perfectly logical. Yes, Leonard Nimoy was fond of sucking on lollipops between takes. Depending on who you ask, it was either because a combination of nerves and dialogue-heavy scenes gave him dry mouth, or because he was a smoker and he needed something to do with his hands. Regardless of which theory you subscribe to, the reason behind Nimoy's lollipop habit isn't actually as much fun as details about where he'd stashed them during takes. Evidently, when the cameras were rolling, he liked to put his half-sucked lollipop inside the lower panel of his tricorder. While Star Trek's most infamous antics happened during the first series, later series weren't exactly immune from unprofessional behavior. When Jeri Ryan joined the cast of Voyager, ratings skyrocketed. It's hard to say if it was Ryan's acting or her skin-tight uniform that gave the show a boost, but Kate Mulgrew, who played Captain Janeway, was not impressed by the decision to take the show in a new, more provocative direction. She was even more annoyed by the fact that it appeared to be working. Mulgrew didn't just keep her budding hatred for Ryan to herself either. She laid it out for everyone to see. First, she insisted Ryan be banned from the restroom because it took too long for her to get in and out of her outfit and she was wasting everybody's time.
There are rules. You'll be expected to follow our protocols. You'll report to...
Happily, the studio realized that it would probably be in violation of some employment law if it refused to allow its employees to use the bathroom, so they didn't grant Mulgrew's weirdly vindictive request. Mulgrew then showed her displeasure in other ways, like walking out of scenes with Ryan if she knew she'd be off camera, thus forcing the younger actress to deliver her lines to no one. And you thought Shatner was a prima donna. Sorry, Trekkies, Gene Roddenberry's Final Frontier isn't really the utopia that it might seem. For all of Star Trek's progressive ideologies, there's plenty just below the surface that remains completely messed up, even hundreds of years in the fictional future. When time is of the essence and you're not too far away from your destination, most technologically advanced humanoid species use their ship's handy transporter to get them from point A to point B. But there's a reason that characters like Bones and Barclay were fans of the less convenient shuttlecraft. They were adamantly opposed to being destroyed and reassembled at an atomic level. The use of the transporter system is an existential nightmare. The ship's computer scans your molecular makeup, stores a pattern of your entire existence in what's basically a flash drive, then converts your mass into energy which moves you from one place to another. The energy is then reconstituted into matter into the shape of you, when it actually works. The person that steps into a transporter is vaporized, and then a near-perfect facsimile comes out the other end. And sometimes it just creates a duplicate of you that turns evil, and you kinda just have to deal. And then you might also just happen to run into some terrifying subspace monsters. All in all, not cool. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was a complicated guy. He was passionate about his work, an epic booze hound, and a known womanizer. He womanized so hard that Star Trek was almost canceled when he snuck his mistress into the cast under a fake name and a wig after she'd already been kicked out of an earlier pilot. That's some next-level shenanigans. True to the Roddenberry spirit, everyone on the original Enterprise was down to clown with whoever they ran into. For the obsessively curious, there's also that LP that Roddenberry produced in the 70s where he interviews Spock's dad on some pretty intimate subjects, like Vulcan mating.
Ordinarily, an Earth woman could not enjoy that. If she survived, she might be severely injured, both physically and emotionally.
As such, Roddenberry may have been the first content creator to write and publish adult fan fiction about his own creations. Next Generation wasn't free from space lust either. It took all of 2 episodes to get to an infectious space horniness story with The Naked Now. And you think Deep Space Nine was safe? Nope. The whole station went nuts and started touching up on each other because of Xanthi fever during the episode Fascination. Coincidentally, patient zero for the disease was the character Loxana Troi, played by Gene Roddenberry's original series-threatening mistress, now his wife, back again in a third Star Trek role. One of the most exciting concepts in Star Trek is the idea that, in a post-scarcity society, one of the highest goals is no longer getting rich, but adding new art or knowledge to society. That's what seeking out new worlds and boldly going is all about. But sometimes, information is uncovered which could fundamentally change the way existence is perceived. And on those rare occasions, mind-blowing news about the nature of humanity is just kind of shrugged off and it never comes up again. In the Next Generation episode, The Chase, we finally get an answer to the question, why does every sentient race look like humans, but with weird foreheads? It turns out that all humanoid life in the Alpha Quadrant was created eons ago from the genetic material of a shared ancestor. In this single revelation, all of history, philosophy, and religion are changed forever. And what happens next?
That's all? If she were not dead, I would kill her.
Nothing. The existence of every known alien species is summarized in one convenient quadrant unifying package, and nobody really cares except Picard and one lone Romulan, who the Federation just goes to war with later. Oh well.
Like everything in the Star Trek universe, the Borg are not nearly as black and white as they appear. That's not to say you'd want a Borg cube for your neutral zone neighbor though, as there are some pretty weird aspects to these Star Trek villains. The Borg made their first appearance in Star Trek canon in the second season of The Next Generation, and like so many problems faced by the Enterprise, it was all Q's fault.
Mon capitaine! He's back!
After Captain Picard declines Q's offer to join the crew, the omnipotent trickster flings the Enterprise across the universe into an unknown sector of space that just happens to be the heart of Borg territory. Instead of turning around and hightailing it back to the nearest starbase, Jean-Luc decides to poke around a little bit, and the crew soon finds themselves face-to-face with the ominously iconic Borg cube. Naturally, our heroes try to make peaceful contact, but the Borg are not that kind of collective. They catch the Enterprise in a tractor beam and carve off a piece like a birthday cake, killing or abducting 18 members of the crew and proving themselves to be more than a match for the Enterprise's defenses. Deciding that they need a new strategy, Commander William Riker takes a small away team to visit the Borg on their home turf. Given what Q has told the Enterprise about the Borg, one might expect the drones, Borg temporarily disconnected from the collective, to go into attack mode immediately when they spot the Starfleet officers aboard their ship. Instead, Riker and his pals are largely ignored, left to explore the cube without being hassled. Why? Because the Borg are busy repairing their ship and can't be bothered with any of these tasty Starfleet officers. Clearly, they don't think these guys cut it and aren't worth the 3 extra seconds of not fixing the ride it would take to assimilate them. Ouch. Sorry, Riker. Klingon apologies, Worf. Not only are they a frightening presence from day one, they're also kind of a bunch of snobs. And forget about it if you're a Kazon.
Their biological and technological distinctiveness was unremarkable. They were unworthy of assimilation.
I didn't.
One of the things that makes the Borg so terrifying during their introduction is that they're completely unknown to the crew of the Enterprise. Well, almost completely. Guinan, the Enterprise's wise, mysterious, and seemingly immortal bartender played by Whoopi Goldberg, knows quite a bit about them. As she tells Captain Picard they killed her people and he absolutely should not be messing with them. According to her, they're not on the same level as the Romulans, the Ferengi, or even the Klingon Empire. The Borg are a whole new ballgame. But as so often happens when a woman speaks truth to power, her warnings fall on deaf ears. When Picard decides to reason with and then attack the Borg, he not only loses a handful of his own crew members and a hefty section of his ship, he winds up sparking their interest in the Alpha Quadrant, leading to the devastating conflict that plays out throughout the series and even through the time stream itself. Picard eventually learns what we knew all along and pays the price for it. Guinan was right. The Borg are indeed a different kind of villain, an unstoppable foe that they'll be forced to reckon with time and time again with devastating consequences. In the next-gen film, First Contact, the Borg order the Federation ships opposing them to lower their shields and surrender with this warm and fuzzy greeting.
Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
Considering the Borg's overwhelming offensive powers, it's about as good an offer as most civilizations are going to get. It seems like there's no one who would be able to put up a fight against such an intimidating enemy. Of course, loyal fans know that resistance isn't quite as futile as the Borg would like you to think. We've seen several instances of someone successfully fighting off the Borg, the first being Captain Picard. After being assimilated into the collective in the iconic 2-part episode The Best of Both Worlds, he was restored to himself after a meeting of the minds with Data. Later, we learn about Species 8427, an enemy even more menacing and cruel than the Borg.
Last 5 months, the Borg have been attacked by them on at least a dozen occasions. Each time, the Borg were defeated swiftly.
The collective has very...
Captain Janeway of the Voyager attempts to trade their secret biological weapons to the Borg in return for safe passage through the Collective's territory. This all happens during a violent, devastating war between the Borg and Species 8427, which ensnares the Voyager crew. It's so intense that Janeway, 7 of 9, and the Voyager's hologram doctor have to go to rather spectacular lengths to emerge from the Borg's clutches relatively unscathed. Clearly, resistance to the Borg isn't entirely futile. It's just really difficult and requires a lot of gymnastics on the part of the writers. Thanks to her experience patching up Captain Picard after his tenure as Locutus, Dr. Beverly Crusher has a surprisingly good track record of restoring humanity to the drones absorbed by the Borg Collective. Of course, few Starfleet medical officers would have had the chance to try their hand at it even once, but Crusher pulls it off a second time when the Enterprise encounters Hugh, a solitary Borg drone disconnected from the rest of the Collective and rescued on the fringes of Federation space. Picard, having had his own traumatic brushes with the Borg in earlier episodes, would like nothing more than to keep Hugh, the Borg formerly known as Third of Five, in the brig, and even entertains the idea of using him as a Trojan horse to wipe out the entire Collective with a virus. Crusher, however, insists he be treated like any other sick patient, and she slowly nurses him back to health. Inspired by their own cybernetic pal Data, the rest of the Enterprise embraces Hugh as well, helping him cope with life outside the Collective. He begins to develop an individual mindset, succeeding in convincing even Captain Picard that Borg can be rehabilitated. Hugh eventually returns to his cube, a changed Borg. Hugh's new individuality manages to infect the rest of his cube's unified hearts and minds, causing so much disarray that it falls into the sinister hands of Lore, Data's black sheep brother. Hugh does, however, eventually triumph over Lore, in part because of his ability to disconnect from the Collective and think on his own. As Star Trek's first sympathetic portrayal of a Borg drone, Hugh sets the stage for 7 of 9 and a longer, deeper exploration of what it means to be human, Borg, and a creature stuck somewhere in between. The Star Trek universe runs deep enough that you can dive into any aspect of it for weeks and always learn something new. Even just the standard Starfleet uniforms have decades of complex history. Here's what they mean. In the original Star Trek, which ran from 1966 to 1969, you can't miss the brightly hued uniforms worn by the crew of the Starship Enterprise. Captain James T. Kirk and other members of the command staff sport golden yellow tops. Blue is reserved for the science department and medical staff. That's why you'll see Spock, the second in command, and the ship's physician, Dr. Leonard McCoy, with blue uniforms. And how about crew members in red uniforms? Though these poor red shirts are often little more than cannon fodder, red is officially the designation for communications, admin, and security. If you watch an episode where a random red-clad crew member is asked to beam down to a planet with the main cast, don't get too attached. They're probably going to get zapped, eaten, or otherwise annihilated for the sake of furthering the episode's plot. As far as crew members in red uniforms, though, there are some important exceptions. Characters like Communications Officer and Translator Uhura and Scotty, the Enterprise's chief engineer, both survive the entire series while usually wearing red. But don't get too comfortable with these color designations, because they only apply to one series. In later Star Trek shows, red and gold switch places. Captains like the Next Generation's Jean-Luc Picard wear red, while Jean-Luc's security chief Worf is usually clad in gold. Though not truly a military organization, Starfleet still relies on rank to establish a hierarchy of command. But how do crew members know who's in charge on a starship carrying thousands of people? That's where the rickrack comes in. In Star Trek, rank was denoted by stripes of golden ribbon on a crew member's sleeves. The more stripes, the higher the rank. Generally speaking, 2 or 3 stripes represents a captain. Commissioned officers usually get 1 stripe. Non-commissioned crew get either a bit of a braid or nothing at all. The stripes were brought back for the reboot films beginning in 2009. The follow-up series, Star Trek The Next Generation, went with a different approach during its run. Uniform colors were more muted, and the old rank stripes, which frankly looked like something you pick up from a local craft store, were retired. In their place, officers wore pips, subtle little pins on their collars. The higher an officer's rank, the more pips they wore. The films played around a little bit with rank symbols. For instance, the different colors and badges shown in 1982 Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. Still, the ideas explored in the movies weren't too off the original mark. Basically, the more stuff on someone's uniform, the more likely it is that you'll have to follow their orders. Zap Brannigan, Futurama's loving send-up of Star Trek's original captain, is all about velour, and with good reason. The original Star Trek was really into luxurious velour as well, but the fabric proved challenging to maintain. Though it's not as if the 1960s were known for comfortable natural materials after all. The fabric initially used in Star Trek was designed to be flashy. Costume designers used a stretch cotton velour for the tops, with a black synthetic Dacron infused with sparkles for the pants. Both materials were meant to subtly glitter under studio lights, lending the uniforms a shimmery 23rd century spacefaring feel.
Do you like your quasi-futuristic clothes, Mr. Powers? I designed them myself.
Unfortunately, the velour was a flop. Many called it that rotten velour, noting that the fabric tended to shrink in the wash and could tear easily. In the third and final season, designers substituted it for a double-knit nylon, which proved to be a much hardier fabric, especially in the midst of a battle with a Gorn, or after being thrown in a washing machine. The original pilot for Star Trek, The Cage, is an interesting bit of TV history. Though it was shot in 1964, it didn't make it to screens in its complete form until a Betamax release in 1989. Bits of the story found their way into the Season 1 two-part classic The Menagerie, but it contained only brief glimpses of what could have been. The original show idea included things like a smiling Spock, different uniform styles, and women in command wearing pants. Instead, early Star Trek became notorious for its gendered uniforms. Men wore pants and long-sleeve shirts. Women were confined to miniskirts so short that they always seemed to be on the verge of an embarrassing situation when they sat down. That's partially why the number 1, the second in command in The Cage, stands out. She's wearing pants. Number 1, played by Majel Barrett, is also a daring commander. However, she wasn't considered right for the character. When Star Trek got its second pilot, none of the women were in command positions, and none of them wore pants either. Barrett returned, albeit as the emotional mini-skirted Nurse Chapel. Nichelle Nichols, who portrayed Uhura, offered up a counterpoint during a BBC interview where she seemed okay with the costume. The 60s were the era of the miniskirt. She wore one on the street, so what was wrong with wearing them on the air? Star Trek the Motion Picture looked like it was going to be a big deal. The 1979 film was the first time that fans would get to see their beloved crew on the big screen. Anticipation was high, then the movie debuted. It landed with a dull thud. While diehard fans still enjoyed Star Trek's film debut, most viewers couldn't get past the plotting story and dialogue-heavy scenes. It did introduce a few interesting trends for the franchise with wearable communicators and a redesign for Klingons. Still, few would point to this entry as their favorite Star Trek movie. Some blame surely lies with the redesigned uniforms. Where the original series had colorful, if somewhat cartoonish togs for the crew, the motion picture made it look like everyone was going to the weirdest slumber party ever. The entire crew of the Enterprise found themselves outfitted in two-piece tunics and one-piece jumpsuits and mind-numbing shades of pale blue and beige. At least the women on the crew were dressed in the same jumpsuits as the men. The uniforms looked oddly dull for space adventures, but at least Lieutenant Uhura didn't need to worry about errant breezes anymore. If nothing else, the space pajamas did look pretty comfortable. Though Star Trek the Motion Picture began the series' tradition of changing Starfleet uniforms at every opportunity, it wasn't until the second film that the uniforms got a much-needed upgrade. To be fair, the striking red jackets of the Wrath of Khan wouldn't have existed as we know them if it weren't for the beige jumpsuits of the motion picture. Costume designer Robert Fletcher, burned by his experience on the first film, decided to stay on for the second to redeem his concepts. Additionally, Fletcher was under strict requirements that he had to work within the budget, which was smaller as a result of the poor performance of the first movie. Because of this tight constraint, he rather cleverly utilized the original film's uniforms. His team dyed the tunics red, because that was the shade that took best to the fabric. Then, Fletcher added a few more militaristic details to the revamped uniforms. This included things like boxy shoulders, stripes, and shiny rank insignias. He referred to the new design as Hornblower in Outer Space, as a reference to the popular Horatio Hornblower series, which is set during the Napoleonic Wars. The maroon color proved so successful that it persisted far beyond the film and back into television with the follow-up series Star Trek The Next Generation. The uniforms that debuted in The Wrath of Khan were structured, boxy outfits inspired by military getup, but that theme wasn't going to last. William Ware Tice, the designer of the original costumes, was ready to completely revamp his original concepts. Tice was called on to design the costumes for the first year of Star Trek The Next Generation. Tice wanted to pull back from the structured look of Wrath of Khan and return to the softer appearance of the original series. For Tice, that meant spandex. Specifically, he employed a heavyweight material of the type often used for swimsuits. He also updated the color scheme, shifting red to the command staff and making gold the color of engineering and security. Blue remained the primary color for medical and science personnel. While the costume department might have liked the spandex, it got poor reviews from the actors. The form-fitting material was unforgiving, especially after a heavy lunch or a cheat day that involved a slice of cake. Robert Blackman, who replaced Tice in later seasons, came to the rescue with a different cut and wool fabric. Unfortunately, only the male actors got the best changes, like two-piece uniforms. Female actors like Marina Sirtis, who played Counselor Deanna Troi, got stuck with uncomfortable one-piece jumpsuits for a while longer. Speaking of Deanna Troi, she acted as the Enterprise's counselor and was actually a Starfleet officer, though you wouldn't know it from her uniform. While everyone else on the crew wore regulation Starfleet uniforms, Troi often found herself stuck in revealing onesies that recalled the first film's unfortunate jumpsuits. Unfortunately, this might have something to do with Troi's gender. Sirtis took a dim view of how the show treated its female characters. She felt that they were meant to be non-threatening and were often prevented from being in positions of power. The character of Troi was meant to be a soft, caring therapist, and her clothing was intended to reflect that gentleness, though with an admittedly sexist twist that lowered her necklines and kept Sirtis trapped in revealing spandex for much longer than her co-workers. Too often, her clothes reflected stories where Troi was made to be helpless or even outright dull for the sake of the plot. Deanna finally got to wear a real uniform beginning in the Season 6 episode Chain of Command Part 1. In it, Captain Jellicoe, an uptight villain for Captain Picard, causes the change in costume for Troi.
I prefer a certain formality on the bridge. I'd appreciate it if you wore a standard uniform when you're on duty.
While the reason for the wardrobe change was embarrassing for her character, Sirtis was delighted. Sirtis has said that she was thrilled to finally get to wear a regulation Starfleet uniform from that point on. We should give Gene Roddenberry some credit, though. While he was of his time for things like scantily clad secondary characters, he genuinely tried to push back against cultural assumptions. Sometimes it worked and became practically legendary, like when he created a diverse bridge crew for the original series. Other times, he pushed for costume parody that simply didn't land. Roddenberry was involved with the production of Star Trek The Next Generation from its 1987 premiere until shortly before his death in 1991. He was part of almost everything in the series, including the costume design. One of his more interesting contributions to that department was when he directed designer Ties to create what became known as the Scant. This take on the mini dress was made out of the same spandex as the other uniforms and was also meant to be unisex. Crew members of any gender could wear the thigh-bearing Scant, yet it was a hard sell. The Scant was ever so briefly seen on a male crew member here and there in the first season, but not after that. Female crew members like Counselor Troi wore it a bit longer, but actors and viewers alike thought it made any female character who wore it look like a space cheerleader. It's laudable what Roddenberry and his crew were going for, but the Scant just couldn't stay. It faded into obscurity soon after the first season. Star Trek Deep Space Nine premiered in 1993 and briefly ran concurrently with The Next Generation. Though both series take place at the same time in Federation history, the uniforms on Deep Space Nine were a serious departure from costumes of the show that inspired it. Costume designer Robert Blackman returned to the jumpsuit design that originated in The Next Generation, but steered clear of figure-hugging spandex. Instead, the looser jumpsuits were made out of wool. Blackman had, like earlier designers, discovered that wool took dye better than other fabrics and held up well against repeated washings and Dominion attacks. The softer uniforms looked like they could exist in a real workaday reality. Characters like Chief O'Brien are often seen in the bowels of Deep Space Nine, the scrappy space station inherited from the Cardassians, which serves as the focal point for the series. His jumpsuit, based in part on a mechanic's outfit and NASA working uniform, looks right at place in the more gritty, realistic world of Deep Space Nine. Star Trek Lower Decks is an animated comedy series, the first ever to take a look at the ridiculous side of Star Trek. While it's definitely a silly take on the franchise, Lower Decks actually holds a clue to the ever-changing and seemingly inconsistent uniforms across the series. In part, the uniforms of Lower Decks are an homage to a never-used 1994 redesign. Showrunner Mike McMahon realized the discarded uniform design for the movie Star Trek Generations was just right for his series. It calls back to The Next Generation just enough to make connections, but remains distinct and colorful in the new two-dimensional context. The latest series in the Star Trek saga might also help explain the consistently shifting Starfleet uniforms. Careful viewers may have already noticed that just about every ship and station crew sport wildly different looks in the show. It seems like Starfleet uniforms might correspond to specific ships and occupations. Someone sent to a space station like Deep Space Nine might wear one type of uniform, while a crew member on Picard's Enterprise would put on something noticeably different. As a result, outside observers can identify a member of Starfleet while also being able to correctly identify where that crew person was stationed. The look and uniform designs of Lower Decks, which have their own unique costumes, add more evidence to support this theory. Just about every popular entertainment franchise has had its share of scandal, and despite its high-minded ideals, the Star Trek universe is no exception. Here are the biggest scandals to boldly go where no scandals have gone before. If you're a fan of Star Trek, you probably have a lot of gratitude in your heart for Gene Roddenberry, the man who introduced Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk to the world. But it turns out that the creator of Star Trek may have been a bit of a jerk. Maybe that shouldn't come as a huge surprise, though. The original Star Trek, after all, often featured women in skirts so short that bending over to retrieve a fumbled communicator was never an option. Furthermore, many of the women in those early episodes weren't exactly the strong, self-sufficient type. And that's probably because Roddenberry didn't really respect women all that much. Before reaching the height of his fame, he was already well known for having affairs with secretaries. And once he was firmly established in Hollywood, there was no stopping him. While married to his first wife, he was having an affair with actress Majel Barrett, whom he would later marry, and it wasn't exactly a secret. He also had an affair with Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura. A former assistant to a Trek writer told the National Review, Roddenberry would have women walking from the costume designer's fitting rooms through to his office in the skimpiest outfits so he could perv them. Roddenberry's vision was definitely worthy of respect, but the man himself, perhaps not so much. George Takei, who played Sulu in the original Star Trek, is openly and unapologetically gay and a fearless champion of LGBTQ rights. With that in mind, actor and writer Simon Pegg decided that the rebooted version of Sulu, as played by John Cho, ought to be gay too. So Pegg wrote a scene for 2016 Star Trek Beyond in which Sulu is depicted raising a child with a male partner.
Because there really hasn't been an LGBT character in the Star Trek universe, and people have been very great about it.
It was meant to be a respectful homage to Takei, who came out in 2005. Everyone thought that he would love the new direction for the character, but alas, he didn't. He told The Hollywood Reporter, "I'm delighted that there's a gay character. Unfortunately, it's a twisting of Gene Roddenberry's creation to which he put in so much thought. I think it's really unfortunate." According to Takei, Roddenberry never envisioned Sulu as gay, even though he was a supporter of LGBTQ rights even before all those initials existed. When Takei found out about the new plans for the character, he tried to convince John Cho that a completely new gay character would be a better choice. After all, if Sulu did turn out to be gay, it's pretty clear he was in the closet all those years, and it's disappointing to imagine that in the 23rd century there would still be that closet. Every major franchise that boasts rabid fans is going to inspire fanfiction. Some creators love and even encourage it, while others find it endlessly annoying and call it copyright infringement. Star Trek tends to lean toward the latter. There's even a list of guidelines that filmmakers should follow if they want to produce a Star Trek fan film. They limit all such films to no more than 2 15-minute episodes, no bootleg props or costumes, no professional actors or producers, no fundraising in excess of $50,000, and no distribution for profit. So essentially, you can make a film, but you can't make money off of it. But you can help enrich the franchise by only using official merchandise. There's been at least one high-profile case of these rules being broken. The fan film Axanar was slated to be feature-length. It was supposed to star professionals like Richard Hatch and Tony Todd, and it had $1 million in crowdsourced money to back it up. Unsurprisingly, Paramount and CBS took the team behind Axanar to court in 2015, and the filmmakers ultimately lost. Under the terms of the settlement, Axanar was allowed to go forward, but only as 2 15-minute installments. Gene Roddenberry was rarely happy with any script anyone gave him. After all, Star Trek was his vision, and it's really hard for other writers to get into the head of a visionary and produce work that precisely lines up with his standards. One of the most beloved Star Trek episodes of all time is The City on the Edge of Forever, a time-traveling tale written by Harlan Ellison. The script accomplished all the things that fans love about Trek, as it featured important themes and a meaningful story. But despite Ellison's credit, the script was ultimately largely rewritten by Roddenberry, as well as other regular Star Trek writers.
TV Guide called it one of the 100 greatest moments in television history. Okay.
Most writers understand that rewrites and editing are part of the process, and most of them will happily accept the credit even if the rewrites don't fall exactly in line with their own personal vision. Not Harlan Ellison, though. He went to his grave more than 50 years after The City on the Edge of Forever first aired, still angry that the script had been edited.
I felt that they had mucked it up badly, and it took, I think, 6 or 7 years before Gene Roddenberry and I even spoke to each other again.
At one point, he demanded to have his name removed from the credits. In 1995, he even published the original version of the script, which included a rambling opening in which he lamented the, quote, greedy little pig snouts who ruined everything. Fans have been commenting for a long time about the sometimes uncanny similarities between Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. But until recently, the evidence that one of them stole from the other was mostly circumstantial. Babylon 5 was pitched to Paramount before Warner Brothers picked it up, but then Paramount later went on to greenlight Deep Space Nine. Babylon 5 creator J. Michael Straczynski just ignored the similarities between the two, mostly because he disliked the idea of spending money on litigation and the general ugliness that would ensue. But then in 2013, a commenter on an IO9 article about Babylon 5 came forward with some information.
Picking up disturbance. trying to get a fix.
The commenter claimed to have been working at Warner Brothers during the time that both series were conceived. He said that Warner Brothers and Paramount had actually been planning to launch a joint television network featuring one science fiction series, Deep Space Nine. But Warner Brothers had already agreed to purchase Babylon 5. As the commenter put it, "I was told they purposely took what they liked from the B5 script and put it in the DS9 script. In fact, there was talk of leaving the B5 script intact and just setting it in the Star Trek universe. In the end, though, the joint network never happened. Ironically, that might be what ultimately saved Babylon 5, since the two shows wouldn't have gone forward separately if the deal hadn't fallen through. Today, women have more professional opportunities than ever, and it's generally easier for them to pursue careers in traditionally male industries, though the landscape is still far from perfect. Decades earlier, it was even harder, and that was true even in the Star Trek writers' room. In 1960, Dorothy Fontana was an aspiring scriptwriter working as a production secretary on a Western series called The Tall Man. Her boss knew about her ambitions and encouraged her to show him some story ideas, which led to her first sale at the age of 20. She had a lot of success with The Tall Man, but she was having some trouble selling her ideas to other showrunners. As she told Future Science Fiction Digest in 2019, people would say, "I don't know if Dorothy can write this. Up to that moment, I had put Dorothy C. Fontana on my scripts. So I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write a script for Ben Casey, which was a series also on our lot, and I'm going to write DC Fontana on the front page." According to Fontana, using initials was her idea, but some sources say she continued to use them because Gene Roddenberry thought she would get less respect if she wrote under her own name. Occasionally, she would even use the male pseudonym Michael Richards. The Star Trek universe is a utopia of progressive ideals, but in the harsh reality of the real world, it was made possible through cheap non-union labor. According to the book Star Trek FAQ, Everything Left to Know About the First Voyages of the Starship Enterprise, costume designer William Theiss was under a lot of pressure to produce enough costumes for the many actors on the original series. So much pressure, in fact, that he decided he simply couldn't accomplish the task in a way that was completely ethical. Theiss spent time looking for weird, futuristic-looking fabrics in discount fabric stores, and then he would bring them to his regiment of seamstresses working inside the apartment he'd rented near the studio. The seamstresses, who were all non-union, would violate union rules by working through the night in order to get the costumes finished in time for production. So all those outfits in that progressive utopian society were basically made in a sweatshop. Star Trek has never shied away from using sex appeal to get ratings, but at least off camera, the actors usually got to escape from all the gawking. Unfortunately for Jeri Ryan, who played 7 of 9 on Star Trek Voyager, nobody ever got tired of looking. Her personal life even became a huge political scandal for her ex-husband Jack Ryan when he was running for Senate in Illinois against an up-and-coming Barack Obama in the 2004 election. Attorneys from media organizations obtained the details of the couple's divorce, in which Jeri said that her husband would often take her to bizarre clubs against her will and pressure her to get busy in front of another couple. Obama, to his credit, said it wouldn't be appropriate for him to comment on what was in those divorce papers. Ryan ended up dropping out of the race and was replaced by another candidate as Obama went on to win the election. Most people who knew Gene Roddenberry acknowledged that he was a genius, but they also had less flattering things to say about him, like that he was controlling and apparently quite greedy. That was clear enough after he hired composer Alexander Courage to write the Star Trek theme music, and then basically stole half the credit. In the entertainment industry, composers are paid royalties every time their songs are played on TV. After about a year of Courage collecting all those royalties, Roddenberry had enough of some other guy getting the credit for his show's theme song, so he wrote some lyrics to go along with the tune and was then able to claim half the royalties as a co-composer, even though the lyrics were never used on the air or anywhere else. Courage naturally was incensed. Even though the move was legal, it was obvious to everyone that Roddenberry deserved none of the credit or royalties for the score. When pressed, Roddenberry simply said, "Hey, I have to get some money somewhere. I'm sure not going to get it out of the profits of Star Trek." Gates McFadden played Dr. Beverly Crusher in Star Trek The Next Generation. She was a popular character, but by the end of Season 1 she was gone, and no one really had any idea why. There were lots of rumors, with McFadden believing that her departure had to do with a male writer-producer whom she clashed with over what she saw as sexist writing. Producer Rick Berman wasn't shy about saying who this male writer-producer actually was. He told Redeeming Culture, "The head writer on the show during the first season was a gentleman named Maurice Hurley. Wonderful guy. Maurice did not like Gates. He had a real bone to pick with Gates. They just didn't get along. He didn't like her acting, he didn't like her." Eventually, Hurley convinced Berman to fire McFadden. It didn't last though, and in fact Hurley was let go himself not long afterwards, and by the third season, Dr. Crusher made a comeback. McFadden has said that she credited the fans for bringing her back.
How difficult it was for you being away.
But the series eventually won over the fans thanks to some truly excellent episodes, and despite a few pretty terrible ones. According to IMDB, these are the best and worst episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. To its credit, the Season 7 episode Sub Rosa really tried to go for, well, something. Whatever that was supposed to be, however, was muddled by an odd mishmash of gothic drama, romance, and science fiction. It starts with Beverly Crusher, the ship's doctor, attending her grandmother's funeral on Caldos, a terraformed planet that looks kinda like a Scottish theme park. During the funeral, a mysterious man drops a flower into the grave, makes smoldering eye contact with Beverly, and leaves. When Crusher goes to her grandmother's cottage, she finds the older woman's journal and discovers that her grandma had a young lover named Ronan, who, for some reason, Crusher has never heard of before. Also, this guy tries to steal a candle.
Who's there? What the hell are you doing? Get out of my house.
Later, the same candle lights on its own, and ghostly hands start to mess with Beverly's nightgown. The same mysterious man from the funeral soon appears, claiming to be Ronan, who then persuades Beverly to resign her post and shack up with him on Caldos. Turns out, Ronan is an entity who inhabits the candle holder, and he's been loving up the Crusher family women for centuries with their very dubious consent. In the end, Beverly vanquishes him, but not before a series of overdramatic hijinks that include briefly reanimating her grandmother's remains. So, yeah, it's pretty weird. And with a mere 4.9 out of 10 on IMDb, you can't blame fans for wanting to skip right past it either. Season 5's The Inner Light is basically guaranteed to break your heart. And it's all thanks to a derelict space probe. Sounds odd, right? But don't knock it, because this episode sits at a practically perfect 9.5 on IMDb. The episode begins when the Enterprise encounters the probe in question. Without warning, it zaps Picard unconscious. And while the crew tries to revive him, he somehow wakes up on a strange planet. Stranger still, the woman who greets him claims she's his wife, and that he is actually a man named Cayman.
This is your home. Of course.
The so-called Cayman eventually settles into life on the planet, Catan, convinced that he must have experienced some kind of traumatic brain injury. His family helps him piece together his life as a father, scientist, and even a penny whistle musician. And that's just as well, too, since Catan is facing destruction at the hands of an unstable sun, with Cayman and the other scientists desperately searching for a solution. The whole episode spans 50 years of Cayman's life, as an aging Cayman realizes that he simply can't save his people. But the Inner Light really twists the knife when it's finally revealed that this has been a vision all along. It's explained to Cayman that the people of Catan launched the probe so someone could hold the memory of their people after they met their destruction.
Tell them of us, my darling.
Picard wakes back on the Enterprise, having been out for only a few minutes. The episode ends as a quietly devastated Picard plays the very same whistle he had learned to play as Cayman. While some Next Generation episodes tug at your heartstrings, others stumble over them and end up in an awkward tangle on the floor. And at 5.8 on IMDb, The Child definitely falls into the latter category. In the opening scene, a ball of light enters the ship, zips around and enters the quarters of Counselor Deanna Troi. She wakes up suddenly, but is otherwise unaware that the light has lodged itself in her body until strange things begin to happen to her. Basically, it looks like she's pregnant. But she really can't recall doing anything that could have gotten her in such a situation. In the space of only 36 hours, she gives birth to a baby boy who she names Ian. Ian continues to grow at an alarming rate, looking like an 8-year-old after just 2 days. Meanwhile, an unknown radiation source is causing containment issues in the cargo bay, which is carrying deadly plague samples. Obviously, no one wonders why the Enterprise, a ship with civilians on board, is transporting a cargo this dangerous, but hey, just go with it. Eventually, the crew discovers that the radiation is coming from Ian, so he destroys his human form, sticking around just long enough to explain that he is a life force entity who wanted to learn more about humans.
He said thank you. I told him we will miss him.
Either way, Troi is devastated as her magical space baby jets off into the unknown, never to be seen again. It's not a great episode. The series finale, All Good Things, starts off on an alarming note. A retired Picard is talking nonsense about time travel while puttering about on his vineyard in France. Geordi LaForge visits him, but it soon becomes obvious that Picard hasn't been enjoying himself. He and Dr. Crusher married and then divorced, Deanna Troi has died, and Picard himself is suffering from dementia, which promises to only get worse. Bad times, basically. Then, Q, the all-powerful trickster, shows up. He's decided to judge all of humanity and treat them accordingly, and he just happens to be leaning toward total and utter destruction. So Picard decides he's got to get the crew back together to save his species. All of this comes together in a plot that moves back and forth between the show's first episode, the present day of the series, and a future in which a deteriorating Picard is trying to save everyone's skin. In the end, everyone involved acts in such a noble and self-sacrificing way that even Q has to admit that he'll give humanity a pass. For a series that had gone on for a full 7 seasons, with so many opportunities to fizzle out into nothing, this episode is a lovely finale. The strength of All Good Things really rests on the characters themselves, whose arcs are drawn together beautifully despite the ambitious nature of the plot. 9.2 on IMDb for this one, and it's easy to see why. Great science fiction takes risks. After all, that's part of the genre, thinking up wild thoughts and using them to say something about our own world. And sometimes that method of storytelling can produce beautiful, profound results. Then again, sometimes it leads to stuff like Angel 1. This episode falls flat so dramatically that you wonder if the writers were even in the room when it was developed. It also clunks in at a measly 5.7 on IMDb. It all begins when representatives from the Enterprise beam down to Angel 1, a planet ruled by matriarchal society. They're looking for escape pods from the freighter Odin, which must have landed nearby, letting loose a number of survivors who are inciting unrest and upending the traditional power structure. Meanwhile, Beata, the leader of the society, takes some time to harass Riker. You know, like a man would in our world.
Relax. We have much to discuss.
Angel 1 smacks of early sci-fi cheese, the kinds of B-movies in which women slink around in tights and go weak at the knees as soon as a man shows up. You can almost see what Star Trek's writers were trying to achieve here and trying to make a comment on contemporary gender relations. Unfortunately, simply flipping cliched gender roles doesn't make for a particularly insightful episode. In the end, it simply folds back in on itself and upholds the same lame stereotypes it's trying to critique. Time travel is a mainstay plot device in the Star Trek universe, and it's also the basis of yesterday's Enterprise, which earned itself an impressive 9.2 rating on IMDb. The story begins when the Enterprise is monitoring a space-time anomaly, and another vessel emerges from the rift right in front of them. Immediately, their timeline goes haywire, and Picard and his crew are transported to a different reality, in which they've always been at war with the Klingon Empire, and none of the crew know that anything has changed. Oh, and ex-security chief Tasha Yar is there too, despite having died back in Season 1.
No goodbyes. Just good memories.
The crew identifies the new ship as the long-lost Enterprise C. Its captain says that they were about to defend a Klingon outpost when they were lost in the anomaly. But Guinan, the Enterprise's mysterious bartender, senses something is wrong. She speaks to Picard, arguing that the Enterprise C doesn't belong in their time and must go back.
This is not the way it's supposed to be.
But Picard is reluctant to send the other Enterprise on a suicide mission based solely on her intuition. Of course, Guinan's right. The Enterprise C has to return to its own time in order to undo the war between the Federation and the Klingons. Meanwhile, Yar learns that she shouldn't exist and transfers to the Enterprise C, desperately seeking a nobler end. The Klingons attack, while the Enterprise C returns, but the fighting comes to an end once the other ship disappears and the old timeline is restored. After the events of the episode, nobody but Guinan realizes anything has changed, and the episode ends quietly as she asks Geordi to tell her about a long-lost crew member named Yar. It's a haunting, beautiful episode, and one that succeeds where many time travel stories fail, by allowing itself to be led by its characters and not by the gimmicks of the genre. Season 1's Code of Honor is so awful that Worf actor Michael Dorn once called it the worst episode of Star Trek ever filmed. And with an IMDb rating of 5.2, the fans seem to agree. It begins as the Enterprise crew stops at Ligon 2 to pick up a vaccine. Things get deeply cringy, however, when it turns out that the Ligonians are all played by black actors in turbans, and that the Ligonian culture is clearly an attempt to emulate a mishmash of different real-world African cultures. Unfortunately, the Ligonians are also depicted as aggressive and primitive.
The abduction I have done according to our custom for all to see.
Their leader, Luton, kidnaps security chief Tasha Yar with the intent to make her another of his wives. Then, Yar and Luton's first wife attempt to fight to the death before the episode stumbles into a hackneyed resolution. Episode director Russ Mayberry was replaced halfway through filming, having been pinpointed as the source of the story's troubles. But that wasn't enough to save Code of Honor. Actor Jonathan Frakes even hates the episode so much that he reportedly tried to get it pulled from syndication. If not for the best of both worlds, we might have never gotten the season finale cliffhanger that's de rigueur for shows today. Love them or hate them, finale cliffhangers have become an integral part of TV storytelling, and it's mostly thanks to Captain Picard and a frightening villain known as the Borg. Originally, the Borg weren't very scary at all. In their first appearance in Season 2's Q Who, they only seemed interested in assimilating other civilizations' technology. With the best of both worlds, however, they become obsessed with assimilating all species and demand that Picard hand himself over. The Enterprise crew does no such thing, of course, but that doesn't stop the Borg from kidnapping Picard anyway. And in the final scenes of Part 1, he's transformed into the mindless Locutus of Borg.
Mr. Worf. Fire.
Obviously, Picard is eventually rescued and the Borg are defeated. For viewers at the time, however, the suspense was unprecedented. Would Picard really be gone forever? Even the creative team weren't sure, having written only the first episode before the season break. Thankfully, they got it together and produced a classic Star Trek two-parter, with parts 1 and 2 currently standing at 9.4 and 9.3 on IMDB, respectively.
From Shakespeare to Dyson spheres, the actors of Star Trek The Next Generation have seen it all. Here's where they all ended up after the groundbreaking sci-fi series took its last flight. From theater to television and the big screen, Sir Patrick Stewart has done it all and won more awards than most. For Trekkies, he holds a special place in their hearts as Captain Jean-Luc Picard, a role he made famous in Star Trek The Next Generation, and continued to play on and off for over 35 years. Stewart endeared himself to comic lovers too as Professor X in the X-Men movies, and he's racked up a formidable list of other credits across all genres, from sitcoms to horrors to a few returns to Shakespeare.
Be or not a bee? That is the question.
Off-screen, Stewart released his memoir in late 2023. He's an avid car enthusiast and continues to follow the Huddersfield Town Football Club, which he supported for most of his life. He's also admitted to taking a keen interest in jigsaw puzzles. Speaking to AARP in December 2023 about what his plans for the future are, Stewart said, "One of my ambitions, should my work continue, is to do more comedy. Making people laugh gave me so much satisfaction, because I've been in productions where I've seen people sitting wiping their eyes, and I feel sorry for them." Jonathan Frakes will forever be known as William Riker, serving as the Enterprise D's first officer for 7 seasons and 4 movies before becoming a captain himself and showing up in other Trek series. His acting career never stalled after Star Trek, as he popped up in popular shows like Lois and Clark, Roswell, and Criminal Minds. He also provided the voice for David Xanatos in Gargoyles, an animated series that saw the appearance of many Star Trek stars. Even non-Trekkies might recognize him from 90s classics like Alien Autopsy and Beyond Belief.
Do you think this story is built upon truth? Or are you hearing the familiar voice of deception in your ear?
Frakes also worked behind the camera, directing films like Clockstoppers and 2 Star Trek movies, while also helming 8 episodes of Next Generation, 3 episodes of Star Trek Voyager, and many episodes of Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds. He's also a part of a select group of Star Trek actors who are talented musicians.
You know, this is a much better way of communicating for you. It's far less confusing than the way you normally speak.
He played the trombone on a track for the rock band Fish, appropriately called Riker's Mailbox, and also gave directing classes at Maine's Rockport College. He's remained close to his Star Trek castmates, telling Edmonton Journal in September 2024, "Our cast is thick as thieves. We've been friends for 39 years and we've been in each other's lives." Even the worst episodes of Star Trek are redeemed by Brent Spiner's Data, an entertaining and endearing android who's appeared all over Star Trek media, becoming one of the most easily recognizable and beloved figures in all sci-fi history. While Spiner has returned to play Data and various members of his family on numerous occasions, he's also continued to flex his creative muscles outside of Star Trek. He dabbled in music, releasing albums in 1991 and 2010, and also made his way back to Broadway for a few shows. He's also appeared in blockbuster films like Independence Day and The Aviator, while guest starring in shows such as Warehouse 13 and Young Justice, in which he voices the Joker. In a 2002 interview with IGN, Spiner disclosed how he thought about quitting the role of Data at the end of every season of the hit show that spawned him, but he kept discovering there was more to uncover. It was about a character who was evolving and growing all the time, and experimenting with different facets of humanity, and playing other characters in order to understand that humanity. It felt limitless, finally. In 2021, Spiner released Fan Fiction, a memoir, a high-concept fictional autobiography that combined his real experiences filming Star Trek with a murder mystery. The audiobook edition brought in cameos from Next Generation's core cast. Marina Sirtis plays the Enterprise's counselor Deanna Troi across 7 seasons, 4 movies, 5 other Star Trek series, and even appears as a computer's voice in the fan series Star Trek Continues. Sirtis also ventured into tons of other movies and television shows over the years, from The Orville to Adventure Time. Arguably, Sirtis' most famous other role is in the animated series Gargoyles, where she voices Demona alongside many of her Star Trek co-stars. Sirtis' husband, musician Michael Lamper, died at the age of 61 in 2019. Sirtis' political affiliation is also no secret, and in 2021 she explained the big issue that she decided to move back to England because of the shift in the American political landscape, saying, "America changed so much in the 35 years that I was there. When I went, I literally thought I'd died and gone to heaven. It was brilliant, and then this right-wing fascist mentality started taking over." She also claimed that there are more acting opportunities for women her age in her own home country. In 2023, she appeared in the Hallmark movie Love's Greek to Me. Michael Dorn portrays the iconic Klingon Worf, and quickly became one of the most popular characters in the entire Star Trek franchise. Worf moved to a starring role in Star Trek Deep Space Nine after the conclusion of Next Generation, and has appeared in more Trek episodes than any other actor. Dorn isn't only known for his Trek achievements, though, as he's often recognized for his voice alone.
That is how the Klingon lures a mate.
With the power of his voice, he's crossed over into other comic-based pop culture franchises like Superman the Animated Series, where he provides the voice of the heavy-hitting superhero Steel and the brave and the bold as Batman villain Bane. In 2023, Dorn received the opportunity to head back to Metropolis as he penned the Steel comic arc Steelworks. It turned out to be an important writing gig for him, which was something Dorn was delighted about after having tried to make it happen for a long time. As he told Polygon, "I've written maybe 4 or 5 screenplays and people liked my writing, but nothing's come to fruition. The big thing about Steelworks is I'm a paid writer." LeVar Burton brings Geordi LaForge to life in Star Trek The Next Generation, but he's also renowned for his other impressive creative achievements. As a host and executive producer of the educational children's show Reading Rainbow, he and his team secured numerous award nominations and wins, including 26 Daytime Emmys. He also had a podcast from 2017 to 2024 called LeVar Burton Reads, in which he would read short stories and discuss the tales with his audience in an effort to encourage people to read more. On TV, he often appears as fictionalized versions of himself on shows like Tim and Eric Awesome Show.
I'm the ghost of LeVar Burton.
And Community.
Hi, I'm LeVar Burton.
He also briefly hosted Jeopardy! Burton joined the board of the AIDS Research Alliance in 2012 and was one of the first inductees on the Sacramento Walk of Stars in 2016. In 2019, a park was renamed in his honor, and in 2023, Burton won an award for his ongoing public service. Gates McFadden stars as Dr. Beverly Crusher, but during the first season of the series, McFadden didn't see eye to eye with showrunner Maurice Hurley, which culminated in her character being replaced for the second season. Dr. Crusher returned from season 3 onward and never looked back.
I did fall asleep reading a particularly erotic chapter in my grandmother's journal.
She also enjoyed a successful stage and television career, appearing in series like Mad About You, Franklin and Bash, and The Practice. She's also given back to the acting community, teaching at Harvard, the University of Pittsburgh, and Brooklyn College. In more recent times, she lent her voice to animated shows like Masters of the Universe Revolution and X-Men '97. She's also a professional choreographer and has worked on classic films like Labyrinth, where she uses the name Cheryl instead of Gates. In 2021, she launched the podcast Gates McFadden Investigates, Who Do You Think You Are?, where she interviewed Next Generation co-stars and a variety of other Trek actors. And as part of the cast of The Next Generation, McFadden and her co-stars received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the 2024 Saturn Awards. Wil Wheaton starred as the polarizing teenager Wesley Crusher.
But shut up, Wesley.
At the time of his casting, fans probably recognized Wheaton from his performance in Stand By Me. As Next Generation progressed, Wesley's appearances became sporadic as Wheaton continued his ascension as a young actor. Even so, the actor didn't forget about the character and returned to play Wesley multiple times.
Shut up, Wesley.
Wheaton's acting career saw him star in films like Toy Soldiers and Flubber, while also featuring in television shows such as The Big Bang Theory and Eureka. He's also received opportunities in the animated world, as characters like Aqualad in Teen Titans and Dr. Peter Meacham in Generator Rex. Apart from his acting career, Wheaton is also a writer, having started his own blog, written a few books, and contributed articles to publications like LA Weekly and The Washington Post. Wheaton also opened up to his fans to write about the mental health issues which he has experienced throughout his life.
Anyway, let's move on to somebody even more important. Perhaps the most important person in Starfleet history, Chief Miles O'Brien.
Trek fans remember Cole Meany's Chief Miles O'Brien from both Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. While he might be more associated with the latter, he's still featured in 52 episodes of the former. Meany continued to have a career that would make any actor jealous, starring in movies like Con Air and Tolkien, while featuring in series like Hell on Wheels and Stargate Atlantis. The highly prolific and recognizable Irish actor prefers to live life out of the limelight, though, as he left America to move to the island of Majorca with his wife and children in the 2000s. In August 2024, the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Gazette asked him if he would welcome the opportunity to reprise the role of Chief O'Brien. Meany joked about not being able to fit into the suit anymore before adding, "Do you want to see an elderly Miles O'Brien? I don't know. It's certainly not at the top of my agenda of things I'd like to do at the moment." In the first season of Next Generation, Denise Crosby stars as security chief Tasha Yar, but the character is killed before the season ends, in the episode titled Skin of Evil. In Season 3, Yar returns as a still-alive Yar from a different timeline, and again later as Yar's half-Romulan daughter Sela. Speaking to IGN in April 2024, Crosby explained how she originally left the show because of creative frustrations regarding her character, saying, "It's such an incredible opportunity. You have so much here, but I'm not going to just be the token hot blonde on the show," but they had a 60s mentality. After Star Trek, Crosby continued her acting career, appearing in the classic Stephen King film Pet Sematary and everything from Suits to The Walking Dead. She's remained close to the Star Trek fanbase, however, as she often appears at the Star Trek The Cruise event and other fan conventions. She's also acted as a producer on the Trekkies documentary films. For Star Trek fans, Majel Barrett remains royalty and one of the most important people to have ever contributed to this universe. Not only was she the wife of the creator of the franchise, Gene Roddenberry, but she also played a number of pivotal characters across different productions. She made numerous appearances as the obnoxious but complex mother of Deanna Troi, Lwaxana, and during the first season of Next Generation, she became the voice of the Federation starship's computer in most episodes.
Computer? Is Commander Riker still on the bridge?
Negative. Riker is currently in Holodeck 3.
Barrett's also appeared in popular sci-fi shows like Babylon 5 and Earth Final Conflict, while also voicing Anna Watson in Spider-Man the Animated Series. One of Barrett's final roles was the voice of the starship's computer in J.J. Abrams' alternate universe Star Trek film. In December 2008, Barrett died from leukemia. She was 76 years old. Several of her Star Trek co-stars attended her funeral to pay their last respects to her. John Delancey only appeared in 8 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, but as a mischievous character Q, he bookends the series as a vital part to both the premiere and the finale. It's also a role he reprises in Deep Space Nine, Picard, and Lower Decks.
Get out of here, Q! No, we are done with random stuff today. We're not dealing with any of your Q bullshit.
And in Voyager, he's joined by his real-life son Keegan. While the actor appears in films like Gamer and Crank High Voltage, he's found most of his success on television, securing roles in Charmed, Breaking Bad, and Stargate SG-1. He's lent his voice to Batman the Animated Series, The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest, and My Little Pony, while gamers should recognize him as the voice of William Miles in various Assassin's Creed titles. Delancey also co-wrote a novel about a Star Trek character, as well as a DC Comics story, and recorded 2 audio dramas in which his character debates Leonard Nimoy's Spock. He also co-produced the documentary Bronies. The actor has also become known as a secular activist, disclosing that he started questioning religion from the age of 6. As he told Skeptical Inquirer, "I was asked not to come back to Sunday school. Mostly I felt very manipulated by some of the religious people I came into contact with." That being said, Delancey said people should be free to choose what they believe in for their own reasons, encouraging critical thinking. "Comfort is one thing, proof is another. I would never take away the comfort that a religious belief might afford."